Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the heart of the wilderness with 8 harrowing tales of camping trips that turned into nightmarish encounters with the darkest corners of human nature and the unforgiving brutality of the wild. In this third episode of our camping horror series, we will uncover the terrifying experiences of 8 individuals who sought peace and solitude in nature, only to discover that sometimes the most isolated places harbor the most disturbing secrets. Each account has been meticulously verified through multiple sources and corroborated with official reports, police statements, and emergency service records. These are not campfire legends passed down through generations, but documented testimonies from survivors who lived through encounters that will forever change how they view the great outdoors. To safeguard the privacy of those brave enough to share their experiences, certain names and specific locations have been modified, but the core truth of each terrifying encounter remains untouched. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily horror content that explores the documented darkness lurking in our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of verified nightmares. And let us know in the comments below which story disturbed you the most, or share your own camping horror experiences if you dare to relive them. Now let us begin with our first account, a story that proves that sometimes the most dangerous predator in the wilderness walks on 2 legs. I have been camping solo for over 15 years now. Started when I was in college and needed to get away from the noise and stress of dorm life. Back then it was just weekend trips to state parks, nothing too adventurous. But over the years I developed a taste for more remote locations. The kind of places where you do not see another soul for days, where the only sounds are wind through trees and your own breathing. That isolation became my sanctuary. I thought I understood the risks. Weather, injury, getting lost, wildlife encounters. I prepared for all of those things meticulously. What I never prepared for was discovering that sometimes in the wilderness, you are not as alone as you think you are. Last October, I decided to try a trail I had never hiked before in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. It was called the Elk Ridge Trail, a moderately difficult route that promised stunning views and minimal foot traffic. The latter part appealed to me most. According to the ranger station, only about 20 people had signed the trail register in the past month. Perfect for what I was looking for. The weather forecast showed clear skies and temperatures in the low 40s at night, cold but manageable with proper gear. I started the hike around noon on a Friday, planning to camp overnight and return Saturday evening. The trailhead was empty except for my truck, which was exactly what I hoped to see. The first few miles were standard Pacific Northwest terrain, dense forest of Douglas fir and western hemlock, the ground carpeted with fallen needles that muffled my footsteps. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, that clean scent you only get deep in old-growth forest. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. About 4 miles in, I reached a small clearing where the trail split. The main path continued straight toward the ridge, but there was a smaller, less maintained trail branching off to the left. My map showed it as an old hunting route that eventually reconnected with the main trail about 6 miles further up. I decided to take it, thinking it might offer a different perspective on the landscape and definitely fewer people. The smaller trail was rougher, no doubt about it. Fallen logs blocked the path in several places, forcing me to climb over or detour around them. The undergrowth was thicker, branches catching on my pack and scratching at my legs. But there was something appealing about following a path that clearly saw very little use. I felt like an explorer pushing into untouched territory. Around 5 in the evening, I found what looked like a perfect campsite. A small meadow surrounded by towering trees with a creek running along one edge. The ground was level and relatively free of rocks. I could set up my tent with a clear view of the stars once darkness fell. I dropped my pack and started my routine. Tent first, then organize gear, gather firewood, filter water from the creek. Everything normal and methodical, the way I had done it hundreds of times before. As I was setting up my camp stove to prepare dinner, I noticed something odd. About 50 yards away near the edge of the meadow, there was a plastic water bottle hanging from a tree branch. It looked like one of those disposable bottles you buy at gas stations, but it had been deliberately tied to the branch with what looked like paracord. I walked over to get a closer look, thinking maybe another hiker had left it as some kind of trail marker. When I reached the tree, I realized the bottle was one of mine. Same brand, same size, even the same slight dent near the cap that I remembered making when I dropped it earlier that day. But I still had all my water bottles in my pack. I checked to make sure, counting them twice, all accounted for. Yet here was an identical bottle hung deliberately from a tree branch like some kind of offering. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Same brand of water bottle, probably dropped by another hiker weeks ago and caught in the branches by wind. The dent was just wear and tear that happened to look similar to mine. But as I walked back to my campsite, something nagged at me. The paracord had looked fresh, not weathered like it had been hanging there for weeks or months. I tried to push the thought away as I prepared dinner. Freeze-dried beef stew, not exactly gourmet but filling and warm. The sun was setting, painting the meadow in long golden shadows. This was supposed to be my peaceful retreat, my chance to disconnect from the world and clear my head. I was not going to let some random piece of litter ruin the experience. But as darkness settled over the campsite, I found more bottles. 3 more to be exact, each one hanging from a different tree around the perimeter of the meadow. Each one identical to my water bottles. Same brand, same size, same dent. They formed a rough circle around my campsite, like markers defining a territory. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my headlamp and examined each bottle more closely. The paracord on all of them was definitely fresh, probably tied within the last few hours. The bottles themselves looked new too. No algae or dirt stains you would expect from something that had been outdoors for any length of time. Someone had placed these here recently. Someone who had access to the exact same water bottles I carried. I started thinking about the trail I had hiked that day, trying to remember if I had seen anyone else. There had been no other cars at the trailhead, no voices or footsteps behind me on the path. But that did not mean someone had not been following me at a distance, staying just out of sight among the trees. The thought made my skin crawl. I retreated to my tent, zipping it closed even though the night was still warm. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see the dim outlines of the hanging bottles swaying slightly in the breeze. They looked like grotesque Christmas ornaments, decorating my campsite. I tried to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe another hiker had the same water bottles and had hung them for some legitimate reason. Trail markers, bear deterrents, who knows? But every explanation I came up with fell apart under scrutiny. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps circling my tent at what sounded like the same distance as the hanging bottles. The steps would pause for long moments, then resume, moving slowly clockwise around the meadow. I held my breath, listening as hard as I could, trying to determine if it was human or animal. The rhythm was too steady for most wildlife, too measured. But if it was a person, why were they circling my campsite in the middle of the night? I reached for the knife I always kept in my tent, a 4-inch fixed blade that had never been used for anything more threatening than cutting rope. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close enough that I could hear the soft crush of pine needles sometimes fading into the distance only to return minutes later. When dawn finally broke, the footsteps stopped. I waited another hour before unzipping my tent and looking outside. The meadow looked exactly as it had the night before, peaceful and empty, but the bottles were gone. All 4 of them had been removed, leaving only small marks in the bark where the paracord had rubbed against the branches. I broke camp as quickly as I had ever done anything in my life, stuffed my gear into my pack without bothering to organize it properly, just desperate to get moving. As I shouldered the pack and started toward the trail, I noticed fresh boot prints in the soft earth near where my tent had been. They were not mine. The tread pattern was completely different, and they were at least 2 sizes larger than my boots. The footprints formed a complete circle around where my tent had been, maybe 10 feet out from the walls. Whoever had been walking around my campsite had done so multiple times, wearing a path in the forest floor. Near the edge of the meadow, the prints led off into the trees, heading in the same direction as the trail I needed to follow to get back to my truck. I had no choice but to follow the same path. It was the only way back to the trailhead, and my truck was my only way out of the mountains. But every step felt like I was walking deeper into a trap. The boot prints appeared regularly in patches of soft earth, always ahead of me, always following the exact route I needed to take. About 2 miles down the trail, I found more evidence of my stalker. Another water bottle, this one not hanging from a tree but placed carefully on a rock beside the path. It was opened, with about half the water gone. Next to it was a photograph, a Polaroid picture showing me at my campsite the night before, taken from the tree line while I was cooking dinner. I was clearly visible in the frame, unaware that someone was watching and documenting my every move. The photo shook me more than anything else had. This was not some random encounter with a disturbed individual. Someone had been planning this, following me with equipment and intention. They had water bottles identical to mine, a camera, and enough knowledge of the area to track me without being seen. This was predatory behavior, and I was the prey. I abandoned all pretense of normal hiking pace and started running. My pack bounced painfully against my back and branches tore at my clothes, but I did not care. I needed to reach my truck and get out of there before whoever was stalking me decided to escalate beyond psychological intimidation. Behind me, I could hear branches breaking and footsteps that were no longer trying to stay hidden. When I finally reached the trailhead, my truck was not alone. There was another vehicle parked nearby, a dark-colored pickup with tinted windows. The license plate was covered with mud, deliberately obscured. I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat, but the tinted glass made it impossible to make out any details. As I approached my truck, the other vehicle started up and slowly drove away, but not before the driver rolled down their window just enough for me to see them watching me leave. I called the police from the first town I reached, about 40 minutes down the mountain highway. The officer who took my report was polite but clearly skeptical. No crime had actually been committed, he pointed out. Someone hiking in public forest land, even if they were following another hiker, was not technically illegal. The photographs were creepy but not necessarily criminal. He took down the information about the license plate but warned me that without clearer evidence of stalking or threats, there was little they could do. That was 3 months ago. I have not been camping alone since then. Every time I think about returning to the wilderness, I remember those water bottles hanging like warnings around my campsite and the sound of footsteps circling my tent in the darkness. The forest I once saw as a sanctuary now feels like a hunting ground where predators with human intelligence can track and toy with their prey. I still have the Polaroid photograph. Sometimes I take it out and study it, looking for clues about who took it and why. In the picture, I look completely relaxed and unaware, focused on my camp stove while someone watched me from the shadows. It serves as a reminder that in the wilderness, the most dangerous predator is not always the one with claws and fangs. Sometimes it walks on two legs and knows exactly how to exploit your need for solitude against you. Be careful when you seek isolation in the wild. Sometimes you find it, and sometimes it finds you first. I never considered myself a particularly brave person. When my daughter Emma turned 14, I realized we had drifted apart during those difficult teenage years. She spent most of her time in her room, and our conversations had become limited to logistics about school and chores. That summer, I decided we needed to reconnect, and camping seemed like the perfect opportunity. Just the two of us, away from phones and distractions, with time to actually talk. Emma was initially resistant to the idea. She complained about sleeping on the ground, bugs, and the lack of Wi-Fi. But eventually she agreed, probably more out of guilt than enthusiasm. I chose Pine Ridge State Park because it seemed perfect for a beginner camping trip. Well-maintained facilities, other families around for safety, and flush toilets, which Emma had insisted on as a non-negotiable requirement. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in late June. The campground was busier than I expected, which was actually reassuring. Families with young children occupied most of the sites, and the atmosphere felt safe and welcoming. Our spot was in a loop with about 15 other campsites, close enough to other campers that we could hear the murmur of conversations and occasional laughter from nearby sites. Setting up our tent took longer than anticipated. Emma had zero interest in helping, instead sitting on a picnic table scrolling through her phone trying to find the one bar of cell service that occasionally appeared. I fumbled with tent poles and stakes, sweating in the afternoon heat and questioning my decision to attempt this mother-daughter bonding experience. By the time I got the tent properly secured, the sun was beginning to set. Dinner was dehydrated camping food heated on a small propane stove. Emma picked at her beef stroganoff with obvious disgust, but she did start talking. She told me about problems with friends at school, her anxiety about starting high school in the fall, and her frustration with her father, my ex-husband, who had been largely absent since our divorce 2 years earlier. For the first time in months, we were having a real conversation. As darkness settled over the campground, the temperature dropped into the comfortable 70s. Other campers had small fires going, and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the trees. Children played flashlight tag between the sites while their parents cleaned up from dinner. The whole scene felt wholesomely American, like something from a camping brochure. Emma even seemed to be enjoying herself despite her earlier complaints. We zipped ourselves into the tent around 10:30, both exhausted from the day and the emotional conversations. Emma fell asleep quickly, curled up in her sleeping bag with her stuffed elephant, the same one she had slept with since she was 3. I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the campground settling down for the night. Conversations grew quieter, fires were extinguished, and eventually the only sounds were insects, the distant hum of the highway and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I must have been asleep for several hours when something woke me. At first, I could not identify what had disturbed my sleep. The campground was quiet, much quieter than it had been when I fell asleep. No voices, no movement from neighboring sites, just an unusual stillness that felt wrong somehow. I checked my phone for the time, 3:17 in the morning. That was when I heard the zipper, slow, deliberate, and coming from the entrance to our tent. Someone was opening our tent from the outside, and they were being very careful about it. The sound was barely audible, just the faint whisper of metal teeth separating one by one. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized someone was trying to get into our tent without waking us. I reached over and gently shook Emma, pressing my finger to her lips when she started to stir. Her eyes went wide when she saw my expression. and she remained perfectly still. We both lay there, hardly breathing, listening to the zipper continue its slow progress. Whoever was outside was taking their time, probably assuming we were both sound asleep. Through the thin nylon of the tent wall, I could see the beam of a small flashlight moving around the entrance. The light was dim and focused, like someone trying to see inside without creating too much illumination. The zipper reached the bottom of the entrance, and I could see a gap beginning to form where someone could look inside or reach through. My mind raced through options. I had bear spray in my pack, but it was on the other side of the tent near the entrance where someone was trying to get in. My phone was next to my sleeping bag, but calling for help would alert whoever was outside that we were awake. Emma was pressed against my side, trembling but staying silent like I had taught her. The gap in the zipper widened, and I could see fingers reaching through, feeling around the interior of the tent. Adult fingers, thick and calloused, moving systematically as if searching for something specific. The person outside was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but with what sounded like excitement or anticipation. Then I heard voices, low whispers coming from outside the tent, and I realized with horror that there was more than one person. I could make out at least 2 different voices, maybe 3, having a quiet conversation just feet from where my daughter and I lay terrified. One voice, deeper than the others, said something about the young one. Another voice, higher pitched, laughed softly and mentioned something about taking her tonight. The words sent ice through my veins. These people were not random thieves or drunken campers. They were here specifically for Emma. The fingers continued exploring the interior of the tent, moving closer to where we lay. Emma squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers, but she remained completely silent. I could see the outline of a head now, someone pressing their face close to the gap in the zipper, trying to see inside our tent. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of remaining frozen with fear, I decided to act. I grabbed my flashlight, the brightest one I had brought, and suddenly turned it on at full power while shouting as loudly as I could. "Help! Help! Someone is trying to get in our tent!" The effect was immediate and dramatic. The figures outside our tent scrambled backward, and I could hear multiple sets of footsteps running away through the campground. I kept shouting, "Help us! Call the police!" while pushing Emma toward the back of the tent, as far from the entrance as possible. Lights began coming on in other tents and RVs around the campground. I heard car doors slamming and voices calling out, asking what was wrong. Within minutes, several other campers had gathered around our tent, and someone had called 911 on their cell phone. When I finally felt safe enough to emerge from the tent, I found that the entrance zipper had been opened about 2 feet, enough for someone to reach inside or for a small person to crawl through. The area around our tent showed clear evidence of multiple people. Footprints in the dirt, broken twigs, and trampled grass where several individuals had been standing or crouching near our tent. The park rangers arrived about 20 minutes later, followed by local police. They took our statement and examined the area around our tent with flashlights, photographing the evidence and taking notes. What they told us made the experience even more frightening than it had been in the moment. 2 other families in the campground reported similar incidents that same night. In one case, a family with a 10-year-old daughter had found their tent partially unzipped in the morning, though they had not awakened during the incident. Another family reported seeing figures moving between tents around 3 in the morning, but had assumed it was campers returning from the bathroom. The police officer explained that this was not the first time they had received reports of this nature from Pine Ridge State Park. Over the past 6 months, there had been several incidents involving groups of individuals targeting campsites with young children, particularly families with teenage daughters. In most cases, the intruders fled when confronted, but there had been one incident 3 months earlier where a 14-year-old girl had gone missing from a campsite. She was found the next day, unharmed but traumatized, several miles away in the woods. The officer strongly recommended that we pack up and leave immediately, rather than staying for the remainder of our planned trip. He explained that the individuals involved in these incidents often returned to the same areas, and there was no guarantee they would not try again the following night. We packed our gear in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by concerned fellow campers who helped us break down our tent and load our car. Emma was quiet during the whole process, but she stayed close to me and kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to emerge from the trees. During the drive home, Emma finally spoke about what had happened. She told me she had been awake before I shook her, that she had heard footsteps circling our tent for what felt like hours before anyone tried to open the zipper. She had remained perfectly still, pretending to be asleep because she was terrified that any movement would let them know she was aware of their presence. The experience changed both of us in ways that took months to fully understand. Emma developed severe anxiety about sleeping away from home and had nightmares for weeks afterward. I found myself constantly checking locks and looking over my shoulder, especially in parking lots or other isolated areas. We never did try camping again. The bonding experience I had hoped for did happen, but not in the way I had planned. Going through something that terrifying together created a closeness between Emma and me that had been missing for years. She stopped taking her safety for granted, and I stopped assuming that family-friendly locations were automatically safe. 6 months later, we learned that police had arrested 3 men in connection with the incidents at Pine Ridge State Park. They had been targeting families with teenage daughters, using the cover of the campground environment to select potential victims. The men had been watching families during the day, identifying tents with young girls and returning late at night to attempt abductions. The police officer who called to update us said that our decision to make noise and alert other campers had likely prevented a much more serious crime. The men had been prepared to take Emma that night, and they had tools and restraints in their vehicle that suggested they had done this before. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear the sound of a zipper being slowly opened. Emma is in college now, strong and confident, but she has never forgotten that night. We both learned that predators exist in places where you least expect them, and that sometimes the thing that saves you is not being quiet and hoping they go away, but making as much noise as possible and demanding help. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Make noise. Wake up the neighbors. Better to be embarrassed about a false alarm than to become a victim because you were too polite to cause a scene. I started wilderness survival camping as a way to challenge myself and disconnect from the digital world that had consumed my life as a software developer. What began as weekend trips to state parks gradually evolved into more ambitious solo expeditions into remote wilderness areas. I prided myself on my preparation and self-sufficiency. I studied edible plants, learned to purify water from natural sources, and practiced building shelters from materials found in the forest. The trip that changed everything was planned as my most ambitious yet. 2 weeks completely off-grid in the canyon country of southern Utah, living entirely off the supplies I carried and whatever food I could forage from the land. I had done extensive research on the area, studying topographic maps and identifying water sources and potential camping spots. The plan was to hike deep into a remote canyon system, far from any established trails or camping areas. I started the journey in late September, when the desert heat had begun to subside, but temperatures were still warm enough for comfortable camping. My pack contained carefully calculated rations for the first week, along with fishing gear, snares for small game, and a comprehensive field guide to edible desert plants. The second week would test my ability to live entirely off the land, something I had never attempted for more than 3 days. The first few days went exactly as planned. I hiked deep into the canyon following a seasonal stream bed that provided both water and a natural route through the rugged terrain. The landscape was breathtaking, with towering red rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side of the narrow canyon floor. I felt like an explorer discovering uncharted territory, even though I knew satellite imagery had mapped every inch of the area. I established my base camp next to a reliable water source, a series of pools fed by a small spring that emerged from the canyon wall. The location was perfect, sheltered from wind and with enough flat ground for my tent and cooking area. During the day, I explored side canyons and practiced the survival skills I had studied for months. I found edible cactus pads, gathered pine nuts, and even managed to catch 2 small trout from the deeper pools. By the end of the first week, I was feeling confident and accomplished. I had consumed most of my carried food as planned, and my attempts at foraging and fishing had been successful enough to supplement my diet. My body had adjusted to the physical demands of living outdoors, and I felt stronger and more alert than I had in years. That confidence began to erode on day 8. I woke up feeling nauseous and weak, symptoms I initially attributed to the physical demands of the trip and the change in diet. But as the day progressed, the nausea intensified, and I began experiencing severe stomach cramps. By evening, I was unable to keep food down, vomiting up everything I tried to eat, including water. At first, I assumed I had eaten something that disagreed with me. Desert survival guides warn about the dangers of consuming unfamiliar plants, and I thought perhaps I had misidentified something I had foraged the previous day. I decided to stick to bland foods and focus on staying hydrated, expecting the symptoms to pass within a day or 2. They did not pass. By day 10, I had not kept solid food down in over 48 hours. The stomach cramps had intensified to the point where I could barely stand upright. Even small sips of water triggered violent retching that left me weak and dizzy. I began to realize that I was facing a serious medical emergency in one of the most isolated places I had ever been. The nearest road was at least 20 miles away through rugged canyon terrain, and I had not seen another human being since starting the trip. My cell phone had no signal, and my GPS device, while still functional, only served to confirm how far I was from any possibility of help. I was completely on my own, and my body was shutting down. On day 11, desperation began to cloud my judgment. The hunger had become a living thing inside me, gnawing at my insides with relentless intensity. I had not eaten anything substantial in 4 days, and my body was beginning to consume itself. I could feel my muscles weakening, and simple tasks like gathering firewood left me exhausted and breathless. It was during this period of desperation that I made the discovery that still haunts me. While exploring a side canyon in search of anything edible, I found what appeared to be strips of dried meat hanging from the branches of a dead juniper tree. The meat looked professionally prepared, cut into uniform strips and dried to the consistency of jerky. In my weakened state, finding this unexpected source of protein felt like a miracle. I should have been suspicious. I should have questioned how prepared meat could appear in such a remote location, far from any established camping areas or hunting grounds. But hunger had compromised my ability to think clearly. The strips of meat looked clean and properly preserved, and the smell was not unpleasant. My body craved protein so desperately that rational thought became impossible. I ate 3 strips of the dried meat, and within minutes, I felt better than I had in days. The nausea subsided, the stomach cramps eased, and I felt a surge of energy that allowed me to think clearly for the first time since the illness began. I gathered more of the meat, stuffing it into my pack like a starving person hoarding food. It was only later, as I was examining the remaining strips more carefully, that I noticed details that should have alarmed me from the beginning. The cuts were too uniform, too professional. This was not meat that had been prepared by a casual hunter or camper. The preservation was too perfect, and the quantity was too large for someone to have simply lost or abandoned it. More disturbing was the location itself. The dead juniper tree was positioned in a small clearing that would be visible from several different approaches. The meat had been hung at exactly the right height to be easily spotted by someone walking through the area. This was not a random discovery, it was bait. That realization led to others. My illness had begun shortly after I started drinking from a specific pool that I had been using as my primary water source. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. Something had contaminated that water source, and something else had provided a convenient solution in the form of the dried meat. I was being manipulated, and I had fallen for it completely. The thought that something was deliberately poisoning water sources and then offering tainted food to desperate victims sent ice through my veins. I was not alone in this canyon. Something with intelligence and planning ability was here, and it was hunting using methods that targeted the most basic human needs. I abandoned my campsite immediately despite the onset of darkness. Moving through the canyon at night was dangerous, but staying in a location where I had been deliberately targeted felt more dangerous. I used my headlamp to navigate the rocky terrain, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any sounds that might indicate I was being followed. The journey out of the canyon took 2 days of difficult hiking while still recovering from the effects of the contaminated water and whatever had been in the dried meat. Several times I found more evidence of the same deliberate baiting. Strips of meat hung from trees positioned where a desperate hiker would easily spot them. Fresh water sources that looked clean but had an odd chemical smell that I now recognized as a warning sign. By the time I reached my truck, I was in critical condition. I drove directly to the nearest hospital where I spent the next 5 days undergoing treatment for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and what doctors initially assumed was food poisoning. Blood tests revealed the presence of several toxic compounds that the medical staff could not immediately identify. The most disturbing discovery came when I provided park rangers with detailed information about the location where I had found the dried meat. A search team investigated the area and found evidence of a much larger operation. Hidden caches of prepared meat, systematic contamination of water sources, and signs that multiple people had been through the area recently despite its remoteness. The rangers explained that there had been 3 unexplained disappearances in the general area over the past 2 years. All involved experienced hikers or campers who had planned extended solo trips into remote wilderness areas. In each case, the missing person had told friends or family about their plans to test their survival skills by living off the land for extended periods. Law enforcement eventually classified the incidents as connected to a group that was deliberately targeting people who fit a specific profile. Solo campers with survival experience who planned to stay in remote areas for extended periods were being systematically poisoned and then offered contaminated food when they became desperate enough to accept it. The investigation revealed that the group responsible had been using these methods to isolate and capture people, for reasons that I was never fully briefed on. What I learned was enough to ensure that I never attempted solo wilderness survival again. The rangers strongly advised against discussing the details publicly, as the investigation was ongoing and the perpetrators had not been apprehended. I recovered physically from the experience, though it took months to regain the weight I had lost and to trust my body's responses to food and water again. The psychological impact was more lasting. The wilderness I had seen as a place of challenge and personal growth became a hunting ground where predators used human desperation as a weapon. I still camp occasionally, but never alone and never in remote areas where help is more than a few hours away. I carry emergency communication devices and enough food to last twice as long as any planned trip. Most importantly, I never consume anything I find in the wild, no matter how desperate the situation might become. The dried meat hanging from that dead juniper tree saved my life in the short term, but it was intended to do something much worse in the long term. Sometimes survival requires accepting help from unexpected sources, but sometimes that help comes with a price that makes death seem preferable. Trust your instincts when something seems too convenient, especially when you are at your most vulnerable. The wilderness will test you in ways you cannot anticipate, and sometimes the greatest danger comes not from nature, but from those who understand how to use your survival instincts against you. Every year for 8 years, the same group of friends gathered for our annual camping trip. We called ourselves the September Squad because we always scheduled the trip for the weekend after Labor Day, when the summer crowds had thinned out but the weather was still warm enough for comfortable sleeping under the stars. There were 6 of us originally, though the group had fluctuated over the years as people moved away or life got in the way. This particular year, only 4 of us could make it. Me, Sarah, Tom, and Jake. We had chosen Sequoia National Forest for our destination, partly because none of us had been there before and partly because Tom had found what he claimed was the perfect campsite through some backpacking forum. Remote enough to avoid crowds, but accessible enough that we would not need to hike more than 3 miles with full packs. We should have paid more attention to the fire restrictions that were posted at every entrance to the forest. The signs were everywhere, warning about extreme fire danger due to drought conditions and unusually high temperatures for September. But we had been car camping for years, and we assumed the warnings were the usual bureaucratic overcaution. We planned to have a campfire just like we always did. It was tradition. The first sign that something was wrong came Friday evening as we were setting up camp. The ranger who checked our permits mentioned that there were several small fires burning in areas north of where we planned to camp. Nothing to worry about, he said, but he recommended that we keep our radio tuned to the emergency frequency and be prepared to leave quickly if conditions changed. We thanked him and made jokes about ranger paranoia as soon as he drove away. That night, the sunset was spectacular. The entire western sky burned red and orange, with colors more intense than any of us had ever seen. Tom took dozens of photos trying to capture the dramatic light painting the mountains and forests. Sarah mentioned that the air smelled like smoke, but we attributed it to distant campfires from other camping areas. We built our own fire as planned, roasting hot dogs and making s'mores like we had done every year since college. The familiar ritual was comforting, and we fell into the easy conversation and shared memories that made these trips special. None of us wanted to think about the fact that this might be our last September Squad camping trip. Sarah was getting married in the spring and moving to Portland. Tom had been talking about taking a job overseas. Nothing stays the same forever. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm, but the smell of smoke was stronger. When I looked to the north, I could see a haze hanging over the ridgeline that had not been there the night before. Jake suggested we hike up to a higher viewpoint to get a better sense of what was happening. But the rest of us voted to stay at camp and enjoy our traditional lazy morning of coffee and pancakes, cooked over the camp stove. By noon, the wind had picked up significantly. What started as a gentle breeze became steady gusts that rattled the trees and sent dust swirling around our campsite. The air temperature seemed to be rising every hour, and the humidity dropped to the point where our lips were cracking and our throats felt constantly dry. The radio crackled to life around 2 in the afternoon with an evacuation advisory for areas north of our location. The announcement was calm and professional, recommending that campers in specified zones consider leaving as a precautionary measure. Our campsite was not in the designated evacuation zone, but it was close enough that we could see the areas being evacuated from our location. We debated whether to pack up and leave. Tom and Jake wanted to stay, arguing that we were outside the evacuation zone and that leaving would waste the weekend we had all planned for months. Sarah and I were more concerned, especially after the wind shifted and began blowing directly from the north, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of burning forest. The decision was made for us around 4 o'clock when the evacuation advisory became a mandatory evacuation order, and the zone was expanded to include our campsite. A ranger drove through the area with a loudspeaker ordering all campers to break camp immediately and proceed to the main highway via the access road. We started packing quickly, but 8 years of accumulated camping gear takes time to organize and load properly. We had 2 cars between the 4 of us, and we had to decide what was essential and what could be left behind if necessary. The process took longer than it should have because we kept stopping to watch the sky, which was growing darker and more ominous by the hour. By 5:30, we were finally packed and ready to leave. That was when we discovered that the access road we had used to reach the campsite was blocked. A tree had fallen across the narrow dirt road, probably blown down by the increasingly strong winds. The tree was too large for us to move, and there was no room for the cars to drive around it. Tom and Jake tried to clear the road using a small chainsaw that Tom kept in his truck for camping trips. They managed to cut through some of the smaller branches, but the main trunk was too thick for the small saw, and the chain broke after 20 minutes of hard work. We were trapped. The wind continued to strengthen and the sky continued to darken. What had started as a hazy sunset effect now looked like an approaching thunderstorm, except there were no clouds. Just smoke, thick and black and moving toward us with frightening speed. Sarah found an old logging road on her map that showed a route out of the area, but it meant driving deeper into the forest before turning back toward the highway. None of us liked the idea of driving away from safety, but it was the only option we could identify. We decided to try the logging road and hope it was still passable. The logging road was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle. We drove in convoy with Tom's truck leading because it had higher clearance, followed by my SUV with Sarah and Jake as passengers. The road wound through dense forest for about 3 miles before reaching what should have been the junction with another road that would take us back toward the highway. The junction was not there. Either our map was wrong, or the road had been closed and the junction removed. We found ourselves at the end of a dead-end road with no way to turn around easily and no clear route to safety. Behind us, the sky was now completely black, and the wind was carrying burning embers that landed on the dry grass and immediately caught fire. That was when we realized we were in a situation that could kill us. The fire was moving faster than we had imagined possible, and we were trapped in an area with limited options for escape. The logging road was too narrow to turn around quickly, and backing out would take longer than we had. Tom made the decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of trying to retreat back down the logging road, he drove his truck straight into the small creek that ran alongside the dead end. The water was only about 2 feet deep, but it was flowing and surrounded by rocks and gravel that would not burn easily. We followed his lead, driving my SUV into the creek bed and positioning both vehicles as close to the water as possible. We soaked towels and sleeping bags in the creek water and covered the cars, then huddled in the creek itself, using the vehicles as shields against the radiant heat that was beginning to build. The fire reached us around 7 o'clock. I have never experienced anything like the sound of an approaching wildfire. It sounds like a freight train combined with a waterfall, a constant roar that drowns out everything else. The heat was incredible, like opening an oven door but multiplied by 1,000. Even with wet towels covering us and creek water surrounding us, The air became so hot that each breath felt like it was burning my lungs. We stayed in the creek for 6 hours while the fire burned around us. Trees exploded like bombs when the fire reached them. The sound was terrifying, sharp cracks followed by crashes as burning timber fell across the creek and the road. Several times, burning branches fell close enough to us that we had to dive underwater to avoid being hit. The cars were badly damaged but provided crucial protection from the radiant heat. The paint bubbled and peeled, the tires melted, and all the plastic components warped or melted completely. But the metal shells held together and gave us something to shelter behind when the heat became unbearable. Around 1 in the morning, the fire began to move past our location. The roaring sound gradually diminished, and the air temperature started to drop. We emerged from the creek to find ourselves in a completely changed landscape. Everything around us had burned. The trees were black skeletons, the ground was covered with ash, and the air was still thick with smoke. We spent the rest of the night in the creek bed, too exhausted and traumatized to attempt any movement in the darkness. At dawn, we started walking out along the burned remains of the logging road, leaving the damaged cars behind. We walked for 8 miles through the blackened forest before reaching the main highway, where we were picked up by emergency personnel. Both Sarah and Jake suffered second-degree burns on their arms and backs. Tom lost the hearing in his left ear permanently due to the noise and pressure from the fire. I developed respiratory problems that lasted for months and still affect me during allergy season. We learned later that the fire had consumed over 50,000 acres and destroyed hundreds of structures. 14 people died, including 3 other campers who had been caught in areas without access to water. Our decision to stay in the creek probably made the difference between life and death. The September squad never camped together again after that weekend. The experience changed all of us in ways that made it impossible to recapture the carefree attitude that had made our annual trip special. We stayed friends, but the shared trauma of that night created a bond that was different from anything we had experienced before. I still camp occasionally, but never during fire season, and never without multiple escape routes planned in advance. I carry emergency radios, satellite communicators, and more water than any reasonable person would need for a weekend trip. Most importantly, I never ignore evacuation warnings or fire restrictions, no matter how inconvenient they might be. Nature does not negotiate, and it does not make exceptions for traditions or convenience. When the forest decides to burn, everything in its path becomes fuel, and your only chance of survival is to respect its power and get out of the way before it arrives. My 3 closest friends from college and I had been planning our graduation camping trip for months. After 4 years of studying, exams, and stress, we wanted to celebrate our degrees with something memorable and adventurous. We chose a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia that promised challenging hiking, scenic views, and the kind of wilderness experience that would give us stories to tell for years to come. The group consisted of me, my roommate Marcus, and our friends Kevin and Tyler. We were all reasonably experienced hikers, having done numerous day trips and weekend camping excursions throughout our college years. This trip was planned as a 4-day backpacking adventure, hiking deeper into the mountains than any of us had gone before, far from the popular sections of the trail that attract crowds of casual hikers. We started our hike on a Thursday morning in late May when the weather was warm but not yet oppressively hot, and the spring foliage was at its most beautiful. The trail was well marked and maintained, winding through dense forest of oak, maple, and pine. We made good time during the first day, covering about 8 miles before setting up camp at a designated backcountry site near a small stream. The first night was everything we had hoped for. We cooked dinner over our camp stoves, shared stories about our college experiences and plans for the future, and fell asleep to the sounds of the forest around us. Marcus was starting a job with an engineering firm in North Carolina. Tyler had been accepted to graduate school in Colorado, and Kevin was planning to travel through Europe before settling down to a career. This felt like the end of one chapter of our lives and the beginning of something new. The second day took us deeper into the mountains along a less traveled section of trail that required more navigation skills and physical endurance. The path was narrower and less well-maintained, with fallen trees blocking the route in several places and stream crossings that required careful attention to avoid slipping on wet rocks. But the sense of accomplishment when we reached our planned campsite for the second night made the extra effort worthwhile. It was during the second night that we first encountered the group that would turn our celebration into a nightmare. We had finished dinner and were sitting around our small camp stove playing cards and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere when we heard voices approaching through the forest. At first, we were pleased to encounter other hikers, thinking it would be nice to meet fellow outdoor enthusiasts and perhaps share stories about our experiences on the trail. 3 men emerged from the darkness beyond our campfire light, all appearing to be in their 30s or 40s, carrying backpacks and hiking gear that looked well used and professional. They seemed friendly enough initially, introducing themselves as experienced backpackers who had been hiking this section of trail for several days. They asked about our route and destination, and we shared our plans openly, thinking we were just engaging in the kind of casual conversation that happens between hikers who encounter each other in the wilderness. But something about their demeanor made me uncomfortable. They asked too many specific questions about where we had started, how long we planned to stay in the area, and whether anyone knew exactly where we were. When Tyler mentioned that we had told our families and friends our general itinerary but not our specific campsite locations, I noticed the 3 men exchange glances that made my stomach tighten with unease. They lingered at our campsite longer than seemed normal for casual trail encounters. Most hikers who meet in the backcountry might chat for 15 or 20 minutes before moving on to their own campsites. But these men stayed for over an hour, asking increasingly personal questions about our backgrounds, our families, and our financial situations. When Kevin mentioned that his parents were wealthy and had funded his college education, their interest became even more intense. Around 10 o'clock, they finally said goodnight and disappeared back into the forest, claiming they were going to set up their own camp about a mile further up the trail. We watched them leave with relief, but none of us felt comfortable enough to discuss what had made the encounter so unsettling. Instead, we cleaned up our campsite, secured our food in bare canisters, and went to sleep earlier than we had planned. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of footsteps circling our campsite. At first, I thought it might be animals investigating our area, but the rhythm and pattern of the steps were clearly human. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening as multiple sets of feet moved quietly through the forest around our tents, stopping periodically as if the people were observing us or discussing something in whispers too quiet for me to understand. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes close enough that I could hear breathing and the rustle of clothing, sometimes fading into the distance before returning. I wanted to wake my friends, but I was afraid that any movement or noise might trigger whatever these people were planning. Instead, I remained motionless, trying to control my breathing and hoping that whatever was happening would resolve peacefully. Around 3:30 in the morning, I heard voices that were louder and clearer than the previous whispers. The 3 men from earlier were back, and they were no longer trying to hide their presence. One of them was saying something about the rich one and easy money, while another voice discussed the best way to handle 4 of them without noise. That was when I realized we were being targeted for robbery and possibly worse. These were not casual hikers who had happened upon our campsite by chance. They had, been scouting us during their earlier visit, gathering information about our financial backgrounds and assessing our vulnerability. Now they were planning an attack that would take place while we were asleep and helpless in our tents. I reached over and quietly shook Marcus awake, whispering that we were in danger and needed to wake the others without alerting the men outside. Marcus immediately understood the gravity of the situation and began carefully rousing Kevin and Tyler while I listened to the ongoing conversation outside our tents. The men were discussing which one of us they thought would be most likely to resist, and they were debating whether to use weapons to intimidate us or to rely on surprise and superior numbers. One of them mentioned having a knife, while another talked about a piece, which I assumed meant a gun. The casual way they discussed violence made it clear that this was not their first time targeting hikers in remote areas. We had to make a decision quickly. Our tents were positioned in a small clearing with limited escape routes, and the men seemed to know the area better than we did. Running blindly into the forest in darkness would be dangerous, but staying and hoping they would leave seemed even more dangerous given what we had overheard. Marcus made the decision that probably saved our lives. He had noticed during our setup the night before that there was a steep slope leading down to a creek about 50 yards from our campsite. The slope was covered with thick undergrowth that would provide concealment, and the creek might offer a route away from the area that would be difficult for our pursuers to follow in darkness. We gathered only our most essential items, leaving our tents and most of our gear behind to avoid making noise with zippers and buckles. Moving as quietly as possible, we crawled out of our tents and began making our way toward the slope, staying low and using the trees for cover. We almost made it undetected. We were within 20 yards of the slope when Kevin stepped on a branch that snapped loudly in the quiet forest. Immediately, the conversation outside our camp stopped, followed by the sound of running footsteps and angry voices as the men realized their intended victims were escaping. What followed was a terrifying chase through dense forest in near total darkness. We crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over fallen logs, and slid down steep slopes while being pursued by 3 men who seemed to know the terrain much better than we did. Behind us, we could hear them shouting instructions to each other and coordinating their pursuit in a way that suggested they had done this before. The chase continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. We managed to reach the creek and followed it downstream, hoping that the sound of running water would mask our movements and that the rocky creek bed would make it harder for them to track us. Several times we had to stop and hide while our pursuers passed nearby, sometimes close enough that we could hear their breathing and cursing. Eventually, we reached a section of the creek where it joined a larger stream, and we followed that downstream until we found an old logging road that led back toward the main trail system. By dawn, we had put enough distance between ourselves and our attackers that we felt relatively safe, though we continued hiking as quickly as possible toward the nearest trailhead. We reached my car around noon, exhausted and traumatized, but physically unharmed. Tyler had suffered some cuts and bruises from crashing through the underbrush, and all of us were dehydrated and emotionally drained. But we were alive and free. We drove directly to the nearest police station and reported the incident, providing detailed descriptions of the 3 men and the location where the encounter had taken place. The police took our report seriously and sent officers to investigate the area, but they found our abandoned campsite empty except for our gear, which had been ransacked and most of our valuable items stolen. There was no sign of the 3 men, and despite a search of the surrounding area, they were never located or identified. We learned later that there had been several similar incidents reported in remote areas of the Appalachian Trail over the previous 2 years. Groups of experienced hikers targeting college students and other young campers who appeared to have money and were hiking in isolated areas. In most cases, the victims had been robbed and threatened, but not seriously injured. In one case, however, a solo hiker had been found dead under circumstances that suggested murder during a robbery attempt. Our graduation camping trip became a story of survival rather than celebration, and the experience changed all of our attitudes about wilderness camping and personal safety. We remained friends, but we never attempted another backcountry camping trip together. The trust and sense of security that made such adventures enjoyable had been permanently damaged by our encounter with predators who used the wilderness as their hunting ground. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong about people you encounter in remote areas. The wilderness attracts people seeking solitude and adventure, but it also provides cover for those with darker intentions who understand that help is far away and witnesses are few. I had been dreaming about a solo winter camping trip for years. As someone who prided herself on being prepared and self-sufficient, I wanted to prove that I could handle the most challenging conditions nature could throw at me. I spent months researching cold weather gear, studying winter survival techniques, and planning every detail of what I hoped would become an annual tradition of testing my limits against the elements. The location I chose was the White Mountain region of New Hampshire, specifically an area known for its challenging winter conditions, but also for its beauty when covered in snow. I selected a campsite near a frozen lake, about 4 miles from the nearest parking area, via a well-marked but unplowed winter trail. The forecast showed temperatures dropping to around 10 degrees below zero, with light snow expected, but nothing that seemed dangerous for someone with proper equipment and experience. My gear was the result of months of research and a significant financial investment. A 4-season mountaineering tent rated for extreme cold, a sleeping bag designed for temperatures down to -20 degrees, and a comprehensive collection of winter camping equipment that filled 2 large backpacks. I had tested everything during day trips and overnight excursions closer to home, and I felt confident that I was prepared for anything the mountains could deliver. The hike to my chosen campsite took longer than expected due to the depth of the snow and the weight of my gear, but the effort was worth it when I emerged from the forest into the clearing beside the frozen lake. The landscape was pristine and beautiful, with snow-covered peaks rising on all sides and a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. This was exactly the kind of solitude and natural beauty I had been seeking. Setting up camp in winter conditions requires careful attention to detail that summer camping does not demand. I used snowshoes to pack down a platform for my tent, ensuring that the base was level and firm enough to support the structure without creating pressure points that could damage the floor. The tent itself was designed to handle heavy snow loads, with a geodesic dome structure that distributed weight evenly across multiple support poles. The first night went perfectly. Despite temperatures that dropped to 15 below zero, my sleeping system kept me comfortable, and I woke up refreshed and excited to spend a full day photographing the winter landscape. I cooked breakfast on my winter-rated stove, melted snow for water, and felt a deep satisfaction at successfully executing all the skills I had spent so long learning and practicing. The weather began to change on the second day. What started as light snow flurries gradually intensified throughout the afternoon, and the temperature began dropping faster than the forecast had predicted. By evening, the snow was falling heavily and the wind had picked up enough to create significant drifting around my campsite. I checked the weather radio and discovered that the storm system was larger and more intense than meteorologists had initially predicted. The radio forecast called for freezing rain followed by heavy snow, with wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to 25 degrees below zero. This was beyond what I had prepared for, and I began to consider the possibility of packing up and hiking out immediately, despite the approaching darkness and deteriorating conditions. That decision was made for me around midnight when I was awakened by a sharp cracking sound followed by the sensation of my tent collapsing around me. The weight of accumulated snow and ice had exceeded the structural capacity of even my high-end mountaineering tent, and one of the main support poles had snapped under the load. Within minutes, my shelter went from a warm, protective cocoon to a twisted mass of fabric and broken aluminum that provided no protection from the storm. The temperature inside the collapsed tent dropped immediately as wind and snow found their way through gaps in the fabric. My sleeping bag, which had been perfectly adequate when used inside a proper shelter, became insufficient when exposed to the full force of the storm. I could feel my core body temperature beginning to drop as I struggled to extract myself from the tangle of tent fabric and broken poles. Getting out of the collapsed tent in the middle of a winter storm was like emerging into a frozen hell. The wind was strong enough to knock me off balance, and the combination of snow and freezing rain created visibility of only a few feet in any direction. My headlamp beam was immediately swallowed by the swirling precipitation, and I realized that I was facing a survival situation that could easily become fatal within hours. My first priority was finding or creating some kind of shelter that could protect me from the wind and precipitation. The collapsed tent was useless, and the nearest tree line was at least 100 yards away through knee-deep snow. I remembered reading about snow caves as emergency shelters, but digging one would require more time and energy than I might have available given how quickly my body temperature was dropping. Instead, I decided to try to create a snow wall that could provide at least partial protection from the wind. Using my snowshoes as makeshift shovels, I began piling snow into a barrier on the windward side of where my tent had been. The work was exhausting in the extreme cold, and I had to stop frequently to warm my hands and prevent frostbite in my fingers. As I worked, I began to recognize the early symptoms of hypothermia setting in. My thinking became sluggish, my movements grew clumsy, and I started making decisions that I knew were irrational even as I made them. The most dangerous was when I began to feel warm despite being in a life-threatening situation. And I actually considered removing some of my outer clothing layers because they seemed unnecessarily bulky. That false sense of warmth is one of the final stages of hypothermia, and recognizing it probably saved my life. I forced myself to put on additional layers instead of removing them, and I increased my physical activity level to generate more body heat, even though the exertion was exhausting my already limited energy reserves. The snow wall I had constructed provided some relief from the wind, but it was not enough to create a truly warm shelter. My sleeping bag was becoming saturated with snow and losing its insulating properties, and my core body temperature continued to drop despite my efforts to stay warm. I realized that I needed to make a difficult decision about whether to stay and try to wait out the storm or attempt to hike out in dangerous conditions. The decision was made for me when my water bottles froze solid despite being stored inside my jacket close to my body heat. This indicated that the temperature had dropped below the threshold where my current gear and shelter could keep me alive indefinitely. I had to move or risk dying in place as my body gradually shut down from the cold. Hiking out in whiteout conditions with no visibility was extremely dangerous, but staying was becoming more dangerous by the hour. I packed only the most essential items, abandoning most of my gear to reduce weight and increase my mobility. The trail back to my truck was marked, but the markers would be difficult to find in the storm, and missing the trail could mean wandering in circles until exhaustion and hypothermia became fatal. The hike became a nightmare of stumbling through deep snow while being battered by wind and freezing rain that cut through even my best cold weather gear. Several times I lost the trail completely and had to backtrack to find the markers, wasting precious energy and time, while my core body temperature continued to drop. My hands and feet became completely numb, and I began to lose the fine motor control needed to operate zippers, buckles, and other essential gear. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I fell through what I thought was solid snow into a hidden creek that had not completely frozen. The ice water soaked through my boots and lower legs, creating an immediate emergency that could lead to severe frostbite within minutes. I managed to get out of the creek, but now I was dealing with wet feet and sub-zero temperatures, which significantly increased the risk of losing toes or worse. I reached my truck just as dawn was breaking, after 6 hours of the most difficult hiking I had ever attempted. My hands were so numb that I could not operate the door handle or start the engine immediately. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes running the heater and slowly warming my extremities before I trusted myself to drive safely on mountain roads that were now covered with ice from the storm. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that I had suffered frostbite on 3 fingers of my left hand and both of my big toes. The damage to 2 of the fingers was severe enough to require amputation of the tips, a permanent reminder of how quickly winter conditions can become life-threatening, even for experienced and well-prepared campers. The gear I abandoned at the campsite was never recovered. When rescue personnel checked the area after the storm passed, they found my collapsed tent buried under 3 feet of snow and ice. The shelter that had seemed so robust and reliable had been completely overwhelmed by conditions that, while extreme, were not unprecedented for that region during winter. I learned that winter camping requires not just good gear and knowledge, but also the wisdom to recognize when conditions exceed your preparation, and the courage to retreat before a challenging situation becomes a survival emergency. The mountains do not care how much money you spent on equipment or how many books you have read about cold weather camping. Nature sets the rules, and those rules can change without warning. Respect those rules or pay a price that might be more than you are willing to accept. I still camp, but never again alone in winter conditions and never without multiple backup plans for shelter failure and emergency evacuation. The cold does not negotiate and it does not forgive mistakes. When winter shows its true power, your only choice is to get out of its way or become another cautionary tale for the next person who thinks they can conquer the elements through preparation alone. I have been a wildlife photographer for 12 years, specializing in capturing rare bird species in their natural habitats. Most photographers focus on the more accessible subjects, but I built my reputation by documenting species that few people ever see in the wild. This required spending weeks in remote locations, often camping alone in areas where human presence was minimal, and wildlife behavior remained undisturbed by civilization. The assignment that changed everything came from a nature magazine that wanted documentation of the northern spotted owl in old-growth forests of Oregon. The species had been declining for decades, and recent conservation efforts were showing some promise, but photographic evidence of their recovery was limited. The magazine offered a substantial fee for quality images of the owls in their nesting habitat during the critical breeding season. I chose a section of the Cascade Range that had been protected from logging for over 50 years. The forest was pristine, with Douglas fir trees over 300 feet tall, and an understory that had developed the complex structure that spotted owls require for successful nesting. Access required a 5-mile hike on an unmaintained trail, followed by another 2 miles of bushwhacking through dense undergrowth to reach the area where the owls had been reported. Setting up camp in such a remote location required careful planning. I carried enough supplies for 10 days, including a specialized telephoto lens system that weighed almost 20 pounds by itself. The campsite I chose was a small clearing next to a seasonal stream positioned to provide access to the 3 different areas where I hoped to find active owl nests. The first 3 days went exactly as planned. I located 2 active nests and managed to photograph the adult owls during their dawn and dusk hunting periods. The photographs were exceptional, showing the birds in the kind of pristine habitat that most people assume no longer exists. I felt confident that I had already captured enough material to satisfy the magazine assignment. It was on the 4th morning that I noticed something was wrong with the forest. I woke up before dawn, as I always did, to prepare for the early morning photography session. But instead of the usual symphony of bird calls that typically greets the sunrise in old-growth forest, there was complete silence. Not just quiet, but absolute silence. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. In 12 years of wilderness photography, I had never experienced anything like it. Forests are never completely silent unless something has disturbed the normal balance of wildlife activity. My first thought was that a large predator might be in the area. Bears or mountain lions can cause other animals to go quiet, but even then the silence is usually temporary and localized. This silence was different. It felt oppressive, almost artificial. I packed my photography gear and hiked to the first owl nest location, hoping that normal forest sounds would resume as I moved through the area. They did not. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that I could not identify. When I reached the nesting site, I discovered that the owls were gone. Not just absent for hunting, but completely gone. The nest itself looked abandoned, with none of the fresh pellets or droppings that indicate active use. It was as if the birds had simply vanished overnight, leaving behind a perfectly intact but sterile nesting site. The second nesting location showed the same pattern. No birds, no signs of recent activity, and an eerie emptiness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I have spent enough time in wilderness areas to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that I needed to leave this place immediately. But professional curiosity overrode my survival instincts. I had never documented a phenomenon like this, and the photographer in me wanted to understand what could cause an entire forest ecosystem to go silent simultaneously. I decided to spend one more day investigating before packing up and leaving. That decision almost cost me my life. As I was hiking back toward my campsite in the late afternoon, I noticed movement in the canopy above me. At first, I thought it might be the missing owls finally returning to their territory. I stopped and raised my binoculars to get a better look at whatever was moving among the branches. What I saw through the binoculars made no sense. The trees were full of shapes that looked like animals, but not any animals I could identify. They were hanging from the branches in clusters, completely motionless, like some kind of bizarre fruit. The shapes were roughly the size of small mammals, but their proportions were wrong, and they appeared to be suspended by something that was not visible through the binoculars. I switched to my telephoto camera lens to get a clearer view of what I was seeing. Through the high-powered lens, the shapes became more distinct, but also more disturbing. They were definitely animal remains, but they had been arranged in the trees in a systematic pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. Small mammals, birds, even what looked like larger animals, all suspended from branches at roughly the same height throughout the forest canopy. The arrangement was too organized to be natural. Predators do not hang their prey in geometric patterns, and scavengers do not typically leave carcasses suspended in trees. This looked like the work of something that understood spatial relationships and had the ability to manipulate objects with precision and planning. I took dozens of photographs documenting what I was seeing while trying to understand what could create such a display. The images showed clearly that the suspended animals had been dead for different lengths of time. Some appeared fresh, while others were in various stages of decomposition. This suggested that whatever was responsible had been active in this area for an extended period. As I was photographing the suspended remains, I realized that I was looking at the missing wildlife from the forest. The birds, small mammals, and insects that should have been creating the normal sounds of a healthy ecosystem were all here, hanging dead in the trees like some macabre art installation. The silence of the forest suddenly made perfect sense. There were no living animals left to make noise. Something had systematically killed everything in a large area and arranged the bodies in this grotesque display. And I was alone in the middle of it. I packed my gear and started hiking back toward my campsite as quickly as the terrain would allow. The forest felt different now that I understood what had happened to its normal inhabitants. Every shadow could be hiding whatever predator was responsible for the carnage in the trees. Every sound, and there were very few, made me stop and listen for signs of approaching danger. When I reached my campsite, I found evidence that whatever had killed the forest animals had also been investigating my presence. My tent had been moved slightly, and items from my camp kitchen had been rearranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate. Nothing was missing, but everything had been touched and repositioned. I broke camp immediately, despite the approaching darkness. Hiking out of the forest at night was dangerous, but staying in an area where an unknown predator was actively hunting seemed more dangerous. I used my headlamp to navigate the rough trail, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any sounds that might indicate I was being followed. The hike out took 6 hours instead of the usual 3, partly because of the difficult night conditions and partly because I was moving as quietly as possible to avoid attracting attention. When I finally reached my truck at the trailhead, I felt like I had escaped from something that I still could not fully understand. I developed the photographs when I returned to civilization, hoping that they would provide clues about what I had witnessed. The images clearly showed the arranged animal remains, but they also revealed details that I had not noticed while taking them. In several frames, there were shapes moving in the background, partially hidden by the tree trunks and branches. The shapes were large, much larger than any native wildlife in the area. They moved with a deliberate purpose that suggested intelligence, and they seemed to be aware of my presence even while I was photographing the suspended animals. In one particularly clear image, something that looked almost human was visible in the deep shadows between the trees, watching me from a distance. I never published those photographs, and I never wrote the article about the spotted owls for the magazine. The images were too disturbing, and the implications of what they showed were too frightening to share publicly. Instead, I submitted a report to the State Wildlife Agency, describing the area as temporarily unsuitable for research due to an unknown ecological disturbance. I have not returned to that forest, and I have not spoken publicly about what I witnessed there. But sometimes when I am working in other remote areas, I find myself looking up into the tree canopy, checking to make sure that nothing unnatural is hanging from the branches above me. The forest taught me that not all predators hunt on the ground, and not all dangers in the wilderness can be identified from field guides or survival manuals. Trust your instincts when the forest goes silent. There is always a reason, and sometimes that reason is something you do not want to encounter alone. After years of working in corporate marketing in downtown Chicago, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of deadlines, office politics, and the constant stress of city life. I had been dreaming of taking a solo retreat to reconnect with nature and clear my mind before making some major life decisions about my career and relationships. I chose Yellowstone National Park for my destination, specifically a lesser-known area called the Beckler region, known for its pristine wilderness, natural hot springs, and relatively few visitors compared to the main tourist areas of the park. I planned the trip as a 5-day solo camping and hiking adventure, carrying everything I needed in a backpack and relying on natural water sources for drinking water. I had researched the area extensively, studying topographic maps and identifying reliable streams and springs that would provide clean water throughout my planned route. The Beckler region is famous for its thermal features and pristine water quality, and park literature described several springs as having water so pure that no treatment was necessary. The first 2 days exceeded all my expectations. The landscape was breathtaking, with rolling meadows, dense forests, and crystal-clear streams meandering through valleys that felt untouched by human activity. I encountered very few other hikers, which was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude was healing, allowing me to disconnect from the noise and pressure of my daily life and reconnect with the natural world. My campsite on the second night was positioned near a natural spring that emerged from a rocky hillside and formed a small pool before flowing into a larger creek. The water was incredibly clear, and the spring itself was surrounded by lush vegetation that indicated a reliable year-round water source. I had been filtering and treating water from streams during the first part of my trip, but this spring looked so pristine that I decided to drink directly from the source, following the advice in my guidebook that suggested many of the thermal springs in the area were safe for direct consumption. The water tasted clean and refreshing, with a slight mineral taste that I attributed to the natural thermal activity in the area. I filled my water bottles from the spring and used the water for cooking dinner and washing dishes. That evening, I felt more relaxed and content than I had in months, sitting by my small campfire and watching the stars emerge in a sky unobscured by city lights. I woke up during the third night feeling nauseous and dizzy. At first, I attributed the symptoms to the change in altitude and diet, thinking that my body was just adjusting to the physical demands of backpacking and camping. But as the night progressed, the nausea intensified, and I began experiencing severe stomach cramps that made it difficult to remain comfortable in any position. By morning, I was unable to keep food down and was experiencing frequent bouts of vomiting that left me weak and dehydrated. I tried to treat the symptoms by resting and sipping small amounts of water, but even tiny sips triggered more nausea and vomiting. I began to realize that I was dealing with something more serious than simple altitude sickness or dietary adjustment. My condition continued to deteriorate throughout the day. The stomach cramps became so severe that I could barely stand upright, and the vomiting became so frequent and violent that I was bringing up nothing but bile and stomach acid. I was losing fluids faster than I could replace them, and I began to recognize the early signs of serious dehydration, including dizziness, confusion, and difficulty concentrating. By the fourth day, I was in critical condition. I had not been able to keep solid food down for over 36 hours, and my attempts to stay hydrated were failing because even water triggered immediate vomiting. I was becoming dangerously weak, and I realized that I might be facing a medical emergency that could become life-threatening without proper treatment. It was during this period of desperation that I made the discovery that explained my illness and filled me with horror about what I had been drinking. While exploring the area around the spring to see if I could find any obvious sources of contamination, I followed the flow of water upstream to its source in the rocky hillside. What I found there made me realize that the pristine spring I had been using as my primary water source was not as clean as it appeared. About 50 yards upstream from where the spring emerged, I found the partially decomposed carcass of a large elk that had apparently died and fallen into the water source several weeks or months earlier. The animal had been dead long enough that most of the soft tissue had rotted away, but the remaining bones and hide were still contaminating the water that fed the spring I had been drinking from. The sight of the decomposing elk explained everything. The bacteria and toxins from the rotting carcass had been carried downstream by the underground water flow, contaminating the spring that I had assumed was safe for direct consumption. I had been drinking water that was heavily contaminated with dangerous bacteria, and possibly other toxic compounds from the decomposing animal. Understanding the source of my illness did not improve my situation. I was still severely dehydrated and unable to keep liquids down, and I was now at least a day's hike from the nearest ranger station or road access. My physical condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I was beginning to experience symptoms that suggested serious complications from the bacterial infection and dehydration. I made the difficult decision to abandon my planned route and attempt to reach help as quickly as possible, even though hiking in my weakened condition was dangerous. I packed only the most essential items, leaving most of my camping gear behind to reduce weight and increase my mobility. The hike became a nightmare of stumbling through difficult terrain while battling constant nausea, dizziness, and weakness. Several times during the hike out, I had to stop and rest because I was too weak to continue. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, and I began to worry that I would collapse before reaching help. My thinking was becoming increasingly confused due to dehydration and the effects of the bacterial infection, and I found myself making poor decisions about route finding and rest stops. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I collapsed on the trail and could not get back up. I was too weak to continue hiking, and I realized that I might die in that spot if other hikers did not find me soon. I used the last of my strength to move to a visible location beside the trail and to set up my emergency signaling equipment, hoping that someone would pass by before my condition became critical. I was found by a group of day hikers about 3 hours later, unconscious and severely dehydrated. They immediately called for emergency medical assistance and provided basic first aid while waiting for park rangers and paramedics to arrive. The rescue team had to carry me out on a stretcher because I was too weak to walk, and I was rushed to the nearest hospital for emergency treatment. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that I was suffering from severe bacterial gastroenteritis and dehydration that had progressed to the point of kidney dysfunction and electrolyte imbalances that could have been fatal within hours. I spent 5 days in the hospital receiving intravenous antibiotics and fluids, and it took several weeks for my digestive system to fully recover from the effects of the contaminated water. The most disturbing aspect of the experience was learning from park officials that this was not an isolated incident. Several other hikers had reported similar illnesses after drinking from water sources in the same general area, and park biologists had identified multiple contaminated springs and streams caused by animal carcasses and other sources of bacterial contamination. The lesson I learned is that water sources that appear pristine and clean can be deadly, and that natural does not always mean safe. Even in protected wilderness areas like national parks, water sources can be contaminated by factors that are not visible to casual observation. Animal deaths, mineral deposits, and bacterial blooms can all create dangerous conditions in water that looks perfectly safe to drink. I recovered physically from the experience, though I still have some digestive issues that my doctor attributes to the severe bacterial infection I suffered. More significantly, the experience changed my entire approach to wilderness camping and my relationship with natural environments. I now carry multiple water treatment systems and never assume that any water source is safe without proper purification, regardless of how clean it appears. The wilderness is not malicious, but it is indifferent to human needs and assumptions. Nature follows its own rules, and those rules can be deadly for people who assume that natural environments will be safe and benevolent. The spring that nearly killed me was doing exactly what springs do, carrying water from its source to its destination without regard for what that source might contain. Trust your preparation more than your assumptions, and remember that the most dangerous threats in the wilderness are often the ones that look perfectly safe. Clean water is essential for survival, but clean-looking water can kill you just as effectively as any obvious hazard. Always treat water from natural sources, no matter how pristine the environment appears, because you cannot see the bacteria that might be living in that crystal clear stream. The mountains and forests are beautiful and healing, but they are also completely indifferent to your survival. Respect that indifference by taking every precaution, even when it seems unnecessary. Your life might depend on that paranoia.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 of the most disturbing true horror stories from the men and women who protect America's first national park, Yellowstone. These are not campfire tales or urban legends. These are documented accounts from park rangers who encountered something that defied explanation in one of the most remote and dangerous wilderness areas in the United States. Each story has been gathered directly from ranger testimonials, incident reports that were never made public, and verified through supporting documentation that most people will never see. Yellowstone spans over 2 million acres of untamed land, where geothermal forces bubble beneath your feet and wildlife outnumbers visitors by thousands to one. It is a place where people disappear without a trace, where the wilderness holds secrets that authorities would prefer remain buried, and where those who patrol its vast backcountry sometimes witness things that cannot be written into official reports. If you are drawn to authentic horror content rooted in real events, subscribe to Buried Files and then hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the darkness that exists just beyond the marked trails. Now settle in as we descend into the shadows of America's most iconic yet mysterious national park. I have been a backcountry ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 11 years. In that time, I have responded to countless emergencies that most people only read about in headlines. I have performed CPR on tourists who suffered heart attacks at high elevation. I have documented bear maulings where grizzlies defended their territory against hikers who ventured too close. I have stood at the edge of thermal pools where visitors slipped on wet boardwalks and fell into water hot enough to dissolve human tissue in minutes. I once spent 3 days searching for a man who walked away from his family at Old Faithful and was later found deceased from exposure in a snow-covered ravine. I witnessed one suicide at the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, where a young man climbed over the safety railing and jumped 300 feet into the river below. These experiences hardened me. They taught me that nature is indifferent to human life, and that tragedy in the wilderness rarely resembles the sanitized versions presented in visitor safety videos. But nothing in my training, nothing in my years of experience, nothing in the countless emergency response scenarios I practiced prepared me for what I discovered at Pelican Creek in the summer of 2019. It was early June, just after the spring snowmelt, when backcountry camping permits are issued for the more remote regions of the park. The days were long and warm, but the nights still dropped below freezing in the higher elevations. This was the season when experienced backpackers pushed deep into areas that see perhaps a dozen visitors all year. Pelican Creek is one such area. It sits in the northeastern section of the park, accessible only by a grueling 7-mile hike from the nearest trailhead. There are no maintained trails beyond the first 2 miles. Navigation requires map and compass skills that most casual hikers do not possess. The terrain is unforgiving. Dense lodgepole pine forests give way to marshy meadows where you sink to your knees in mud. Grizzly bears are common. Cell phone reception does not exist. It is the kind of place where if something goes wrong, you are on your own until someone notices you are missing. And that could take days. The call came through on my radio at 6:30 in the morning. Dispatch informed me that a day hiker had reported finding an abandoned campsite near Pelican Creek. The hiker said the tent was still standing, the bear canister was full of food, and camping gear was scattered around the site, as if the occupant had simply vanished mid-meal. This was concerning, but not unprecedented. Sometimes campers get spooked by wildlife and abandon their gear to hike out faster. Sometimes they get injured and leave everything behind to seek help. I grabbed my pack, loaded it with medical supplies and emergency communication equipment, and started the hike at dawn. The trail was muddy from recent rain. I moved quickly, covering the first 4 miles in just over an hour. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a raven and the distant rush of Pelican Creek swollen with snowmelt. As I approached the reported coordinates, I began looking for signs of bear activity. Fresh scat, torn up logs, claw marks on trees. If a bear had raided the camp, there would be evidence. But I saw nothing. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. I have spent enough time in the backcountry to trust that instinct when the wilderness goes silent. I found the campsite exactly where the day hiker had marked it on his GPS. The tent was a high-end mountaineering model, expensive and well-maintained. It was properly staked and the rainfly was secure. But the back panel of the tent had been cut, not torn by an animal. Cut. A clean vertical slash approximately 3 feet long, made with a sharp blade. I knelt down and examined the edges of the cut fabric. The slice was deliberate and precise. This was not a bear. This was not an accident. Someone had taken a knife and methodically opened the back of this tent from the outside. Inside the tent, I found a sleeping bag laid out flat. There was blood on the pillow. Not a large amount, but enough to indicate a nosebleed or a minor head wound. The occupant's headlamp was still hanging from the tent ceiling. A book lay open on the sleeping pad. Whoever had been here left in a hurry or was forced to leave. I backed out carefully, trying not to disturb potential evidence, and began a wider search of the area. 50 feet from the tent, I found a day pack hanging from a tree branch in a proper bear hang. Inside were a wallet, car keys, and a phone with a dead battery. The wallet belonged to a woman named Sarah Chen, age 29, with a California driver's license. I radioed dispatch with the information and continued searching. The next discovery made my stomach drop. 2 miles east of the first campsite, I found another abandoned tent. This one was older, a budget model that had seen better days. It too had a clean cut through the back panel. The sleeping bag inside had what appeared to be dried blood on the exterior. The camp stove was cold, but had been used recently. I found a permit tag tied to a nearby tree. This campsite had been issued to a woman named Jessica Ramirez 3 weeks earlier. She had filed a solo hiking itinerary for 5 days. According to the permit records, she had checked out on time and driven away from the park. Or at least someone using her vehicle had driven away. I was now operating on the assumption that I was dealing with a crime scene. Multiple crime scenes. I radioed for backup and began documenting everything with my camera. That is when I noticed the tree cache. About 200 yards from the second campsite, someone had built a small platform between 2 pine trees about 15 feet off the ground. It was well hidden and would have been invisible to anyone not actively searching the area. I climbed up carefully and found a waterproof ammunition box secured to the platform. Inside were photographs, hundreds of photographs, all of women, solo female hikers on trails, women setting up tents, women filtering water from streams, women sleeping in their tents, photographed through the mesh doors with a telephoto lens. Some of the photos had handwritten notes on the back, dates, locations, physical descriptions. One photo showed Sarah Chen at her campsite the day before I found it. Another showed Jessica Ramirez on the trail 3 weeks earlier. But there were others. Women I did not recognize. women whose faces I had never seen in missing person reports. How many others had there been? My hands were shaking as I radioed dispatch again. I provided the GPS coordinates and requested immediate law enforcement response and a helicopter evacuation for the evidence. I was told to secure the scene and wait. But I could not wait. Because as I was climbing down from the tree platform, my radio went dead. Not low battery, not out of range, dead. The screen went black and it would not power back on. I checked my backup handheld radio. Same thing. Both devices, fully charged that morning, were completely non-functional. I was 7 miles from the trailhead with no communication and a growing certainty that I was not alone. The footsteps started about 5 minutes later, soft and deliberate. Someone walking slowly through the forest approximately 50 yards to my west, moving parallel to my position. I froze and listened. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. When I moved, they moved. I was being tracked. I have encountered countless wild animals in the backcountry, and I know how they move. This was not an animal. This was a person matching my pace and staying just out of sight. I pulled my bear spray from its holster and started moving toward the main trail as quickly as I could without running. Running would signal fear. Running would make me pray. The presence stayed with me for another 10 minutes. Then the footsteps grew closer. I turned and saw him. A man, maybe 40 years old, wearing hiking clothes that were too clean for someone who had been in the backcountry. He was carrying a coil of climbing rope over one shoulder and a large fixed-blade hunting knife on his belt. His face was calm. Too calm. I recognized him immediately. I had seen him at the ranger station permit office multiple times over the past 2 years. He was a frequent visitor who always requested permits for remote areas. He always hiked alone. He always smiled and made small talk about the weather and the trail conditions. I had never thought twice about him. He stopped about 20 feet away from me and smiled that same friendly smile. He said, "Ashton, I know your name from your uniform. You have been looking at my work." His voice was casual, as if we had run into each other at a coffee shop. I kept my hand on the bear spray and told him I needed him to stay where he was. He laughed. Not a threatening laugh, just amused. He said, "You cannot stop this with bear spray, Ashton. And your radios do not work out here. I made sure of that." He held up a small electronic device that I did not recognize. Some kind of signal jammer. I asked him what he wanted. He tilted his head and considered the question. Then he said, "I have been collecting from women who camp alone. They come out here thinking they are safe, thinking the only danger is bears and bad weather. But they are wrong. The real danger is people like me who know how to move through these woods without leaving traces. I have been doing this for 3 years. You found Sarah and you found Jessica, but you have not found the others." I felt my blood turn to ice. I asked him how many others. He smiled wider and said, 3 confirmed. 4 if you count the one from last season who fell into a thermal pool after I chased her there. That one was ruled an accident." He began walking toward me slowly. I raised the bear spray and told him to stop or I would deploy it. He stopped but kept talking. "I will tell you where they are buried, Ashton. I will tell you everything. Because I am done. This is the end game. You found my cache. You found my photos. Law enforcement will be here soon, even if your radios are jammed. I knew this day would come eventually." He reached into his jacket pocket and I tensed, ready to spray. But he pulled out a folded piece of paper. He dropped it on the ground between us and took 3 steps back. 3 locations, GPS coordinates, You will find remains at all three, near Heart Lake, near Shoshone Lake, near the thoroughfare, all solo female hikers, all reported as accidental deaths or voluntary disappearances. No one suspected murder because nobody expects a predator in a place like this. I did not move to pick up the paper. I asked him why he was telling me this. He said, "Because I want you to know I won. 3 years I hunted in America's most famous wilderness and nobody noticed. And when they finally do notice, I will be famous. People will make documentaries about me. The Yellowstone Predator. That has a nice ring to it." He was insane, completely detached from reality. I needed to keep him talking until help arrived. I asked him why he chose this park. He said, "Because it is easy. Millions of visitors every year, thousands of miles of backcountry. Solo hikers are common. When someone goes missing, everyone assumes it was nature. A bear attack, a fall, hypothermia. Nobody looks for a man with a knife." Then I heard it. The distant sound of helicopter rotors. My emergency beacon. I had activated it before my radios died, and I had forgotten about it in the chaos of the confrontation. The sound grew louder. The man heard it too. His expression changed from calm to angry. He looked at me and said, "You activated a beacon." It was not a question. I nodded. He glanced up at the sky where the helicopter was approaching, and then back at me. For a moment, I thought he would charge. But instead, he turned and ran into the forest, crashing through the undergrowth like a panicked animal. The helicopter landed in a nearby meadow 10 minutes later. I guided them to the location and gave a full report. A massive search operation was launched. They found him 16 hours later, hiding in a drainage culvert near the park's east entrance. He had tried to walk out through 30 miles of wilderness, but had gotten disoriented. When they searched his vehicle, they found journals. Detailed journals describing 12 potential victims he had been watching. Maps with marked campsites, lists of names and dates. They found remains at 3 of the 4 locations he had described. Sarah Chen, Jessica Ramirez, and 2 other women who had been listed as missing persons from 2017 and 2018. The 4th location near the thermal pool yielded nothing. The acidic water had dissolved everything. I transferred to a different ranger station 6 months after the trial concluded. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But I cannot do backcountry patrols anymore. Every time I see a solo female hiker on a remote trail, I think about the ones we did not find in time. I think about how easily evil can hide in a place that people associate with natural beauty. And I think about the fact that for 3 years, a predator walked among us wearing a smile and carrying a permit, and none of us knew. The wilderness does not care if you live or die. But at least the wilderness is honest about its dangers. The real horror is that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods is not the wildlife. It is the other people. I do not believe in ghosts. Or rather, I did not believe in ghosts until my 3rd season patrolling the thoroughfare region of Yellowstone National Park. The thoroughfare is not a place that casual visitors ever see. It exists in the southeastern corner of the park, where Wyoming borders the Teton Wilderness. If you stand at certain points along the Yellowstone River in this area, you are farther from a road than anywhere else in the lower 48 states. It is 32 miles from the nearest trailhead. There are no cell towers, no ranger stations, no emergency services within a day's hike. When you patrol the thoroughfare, you accept that you are truly alone. Or at least, that is what I believed before the summer of 2017. My name is Quinn. I have worked for the National Park Service for 8 years, and I specifically requested assignment to remote backcountry patrols because I prefer solitude to the chaos of tourist-heavy areas. I am comfortable with isolation. I grew up in rural Alaska, where the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and winter darkness lasted 19 hours a day. Silence does not bother me. Empty wilderness does not frighten me. I have spent weeks alone in grizzly country without experiencing anything resembling fear. But what happened during those August nights in the thoroughfare changed something fundamental in how I understand the world. It forced me to accept that there are phenomena which cannot be explained by training manuals or rational thinking. The first incident occurred on August 9th. I was on a standard 5-day patrol loop that would take me through the southern portion of the thoroughfare backcountry. My route included checking several designated campsites to ensure compliance with park regulations and to monitor wildlife activity. The weather had been clear for 3 days, and I was making good time. I reached the upper Yellowstone River Valley around 4 p.m. and decided to check a campsite that sits on a small bluff overlooking the river. This particular site is rarely used because it requires fording the river twice to reach it. Most backpackers choose easier routes. As I approached the site, I immediately noticed smoke. A campfire was burning in the fire ring. This was unusual for several reasons. First, no permits had been issued for that site in over 2 weeks. I checked the permit log before departing on patrol. Second, the fire was burning cleanly with no one attending it. Third, there was no tent, no backpack, no camping gear of any kind visible. Just a fire burning alone in the wilderness. I moved closer cautiously, scanning the surrounding forest for whoever had built the fire. The area was silent except for the sound of the river and the crackle of burning wood. I called out. No response. I walked a complete circle around the campsite perimeter. No tent, no food cache, no sign of human presence except the fire itself. Then I noticed the boot prints, fresh tracks in the soft earth around the fire ring. They were large, probably a size 11 or 12 men's hiking boot. The tracks circled the fire multiple times and then led away from the campsite, heading north toward a dense stand of lodgepole pines. I followed them for approximately 50 yards until they simply stopped. Not at a rock outcrop where they might have been obscured. Not at the river where someone might have waded away. They just ended in the middle of a game trail, as if the person had evaporated mid-step. I returned to the campsite and extinguished the fire. It had been burning hot and recent. The coals were still glowing red beneath the ash. I estimated it had been lit within the past 2 hours. I left a citation notice at the site for illegal camping without a permit and continued my patrol. I assumed I would find the mystery campers somewhere along the trail ahead. Perhaps they had wandered off to explore or to use the bathroom and would return to find their fire extinguished and the citation waiting. It was a violation, but not particularly concerning. People sometimes bend the rules in remote areas, thinking no one will notice. The next morning, I broke camp at sunrise and continued north along the river. Around noon, I reached another designated campsite approximately 8 miles from the first location. As I crested the small rise that led to the site, I stopped. Smoke. Another campfire burning alone with no visible camp setup. This was no longer a coincidence. This was deliberate. Someone was either following me or moving ahead of me, building fires at every campsite along my route. I approached cautiously with my hand on my bear spray. Again, I called out. Again, no response. The fire was fresh and burning hot. The same boot prints circled the fire ring. The same tracks led away into the forest and stopped abruptly 40 yards from the campsite. I radioed dispatch. I reported the situation and requested information about any other rangers or park personnel in the area. Dispatch confirmed I was the only authorized person in that section of the park. They checked for research permits or wildlife monitoring teams. Nothing. I was told to continue documenting the incidents and to report any contact with the individual responsible. I extinguished the second fire, photographed the boot prints, and moved on. But I was no longer comfortable. Something about the precision of the tracks ending in impossible locations bothered me deeply. I have tracked animals and humans for years. Tracks do not simply vanish unless someone is deliberately obscuring them, but there was no evidence of that. No brushed out prints, no careful stepping on rocks, just footprints that stopped as if the person had been lifted into the air. That night, I made camp at a location off-trail about 3 miles north of the second fire site. I did not use a designated campsite. I wanted to be somewhere unpredictable in case someone was tracking me. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. I ate a cold dinner because I did not want to build a fire and signal my location. As darkness fell, I sat outside my tent and watched the stars emerge over the mountains. The Milky Way was brilliant in the lightless sky. I felt the familiar peace that comes from being far from civilization. But that peace did not last. At 3:47 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps circling my campsite. I lay completely still and listened. The steps were heavy, boot steps, not animal paws. They moved around my tent in a clockwise direction, pausing occasionally as if the person was examining something. I reached slowly for my headlamp and bear spray. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought whoever was outside would hear it. The footsteps completed one full circle and then stopped directly in front of my tent door. I could see the shadow of a person silhouetted against the fabric by moonlight. A tall figure standing motionless. I shouted, "This is a National Park Ranger. Identify yourself." No response. The shadow did not move. I unzipped my tent door quickly and shone my headlamp at the figure. Nothing. No one there. I scrambled out of the tent and swept my light across the entire campsite. Empty. The forest was silent, not even the usual night sounds of birds or small mammals. Just absolute silence. I checked the ground around my tent. Boot prints. The same size 11 or 12 prints I had seen at the 2 fire sites. They circled my tent twice and then led away into the forest. I followed them with my flashlight. 20 feet from my tent, they stopped. Same as before. Just ended mid-stride on flat ground with no explanation. I did not sleep for the rest of that night. I sat with my back against a tree facing my tent with my bear spray in one hand and my satellite communicator in the other. I considered activating the emergency beacon, but I had no physical threat to report. Just footprints and a shadow. At first light, I packed my gear and continued north at a rapid pace. I wanted out of the thoroughfare. I wanted to reach the trailhead and file a formal incident report with details that made sense. But the incidents were not over. On the 4th night of my patrol, I was camped at an official site near the southern boundary of the thoroughfare region. I was exhausted from 3 nights of minimal sleep and hypervigilance. I fell asleep around 9 p.m. despite my anxiety. I woke at 2:30 a.m. to orange light flickering against my tent walls. Fire. I rushed outside expecting to find my campsite ablaze. But it was not my fire ring that was burning. Approximately 100 yards away, down a slope near the river, another fire was burning brightly. I could see the flames clearly through the trees, and I could see a figure sitting beside it. A person sitting completely still, facing away from me toward the river. I grabbed my flashlight and started down the slope. As I got closer, I could see more details. The person was wearing dark clothing. They sat on the ground with their knees pulled up, arms wrapped around their legs, head down. They did not react to the sound of my approach. I called out when I was about 30 feet away. "Park Service, I need to speak with you." No response, no movement. I moved closer. 20 feet, 10 feet. I was now close enough to see that the person was wearing an old-style ranger uniform, the kind that had not been issued since the 1960s or 70s. Dark green wool with a campaign hat sitting on the ground beside them. I stopped. Something was profoundly wrong. The air around the fire felt cold despite the heat of the flames. My breath formed visible clouds. I said, "Sir, I need you to respond." The figure slowly raised its head and turned to look at me. I will never forget what I saw. It was not a face. Or rather, it was a face. But it was wrong. The features were blurred, as if I was looking at someone through frosted glass. The eyes were dark voids. The mouth did not move, but I heard a voice. It did not come from the figure. It came from everywhere at once. A whisper that filled the forest. This is where it happened. I ran. I am not proud of that. But I ran. I crashed back up the slope to my campsite, threw my gear into my pack without bothering to break down my tent properly, and started hiking north in the darkness. I used my headlamp, and I moved as fast as the terrain allowed. I did not look back. I hiked for 6 hours straight until sunrise, and then I kept hiking. I reached the trailhead 14 hours later, far ahead of my planned schedule. I was scratched, exhausted, and probably dehydrated, but I was out. I filed an incident report that I knew sounded insane. I reported the fires, the footprints, and the figure by the river. My supervisor listened without interrupting, and then asked if I had been experiencing any health issues or medication side effects. I understood what he was really asking. Was I having a mental health crisis? Was I hallucinating? I told him I was physically fine and that I knew how my report sounded. He told me to take a week off and to follow up with the park psychologist. I agreed because I wanted answers as much as he did. During that week, I did research. I accessed historical park records going back to the 1960s. I found an incident from August 1964. A ranger named Thomas McKinley had drowned while attempting to ford the Yellowstone River in the Thoroughfare region. His body was recovered 3 miles downstream from his last known campsite. The recovery team found his gear still at the campsite with a fire burning in the ring. According to the report, McKinley had been camping alone and had left his site to ford the river at night for reasons unknown. His body was found wearing the uniform of that era, dark green wool. The report included a photograph. I recognized the face despite the blurring I had seen. It was the same person. I returned to work after my week off, but I requested reassignment to a different patrol area. My supervisor approved without asking questions. I think he was relieved. But before I left, I spoke quietly with 2 other veteran rangers who had worked the thoroughfare for years. I asked if they had ever experienced anything unusual in that area. Both became uncomfortable. One told me that every ranger who has worked that region long enough sees the fires. They appear annually on August 12th, the date of McKinley's drowning. No one investigates them anymore. No one hikes down to see who is sitting beside them. It is an unspoken understanding that some patrols are best left incomplete. I do not work the thoroughfare anymore. I patrol different regions of Yellowstone where the strangeness is limited to wildlife and weather. But I know the fires still burn every August. I know the footprints still appear circling campsites in impossible patterns. And I know that Ranger McKinley is still out there, sitting by his fire, waiting for someone to understand what happened. I do not want to be that person. I have accepted that there are places in this park where the dead do not rest, and I am content to let them keep their vigil undisturbed. The thermal basin off Norris Geyser should have been empty. It was February. Temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and no permits had been issued for backcountry winter camping in that zone for 3 weeks. The area was officially closed to overnight camping from November through April due to unstable thermal features and extreme weather conditions. So when our helicopter pilot radioed that he had spotted smoke rising from the restricted zone during a routine flyover, we knew something was very wrong. My name is Declan. I have been a law enforcement ranger at Yellowstone for 6 years, and I have dealt with every variety of permit violation imaginable. Tourists who ignore trail closures to get closer to bison, hikers who camp illegally in thermal areas and end up with third-degree burns, people who drive off-road or vandalize geothermal features. Most violations are born from ignorance or arrogance. But what we found at Norris Basin that February was neither. It was something far stranger and far more disturbing than anything in my training had prepared me for. I was paired with another ranger named Foster for the investigation. We loaded our gear into packs and began the ski approach at first light the following morning. The plan was to ski 9 miles into the closed area, document the illegal camp, issue citations, and escort whoever was out there back to civilization. The temperature was brutal. Wind chill put us at 35 below zero. The kind of cold that burns exposed skin in minutes and turns your breath into ice crystals that hang in the air. No rational person would choose to camp in these conditions. That should have been our first warning that we were not dealing with rational people. The ski took us 4 hours through deep powder and across frozen streams. The landscape was otherworldly. Steam from thermal vents rose into the frigid air, creating pillars of mist that glowed orange in the low winter sun. The ground beneath us was a patchwork of snow and bare earth, where heat from underground kept the surface above freezing. We could hear the distant rumble and hiss of geysers, and smell the sulfur that permeated everything in this part of the park. As we got closer to the coordinates the pilot had marked, we began to see tracks. Ski tracks. Multiple sets leading in from different directions, all converging on the same location. We crested a small ridge and looked down into a shallow basin dominated by a large boiling mud pot. What we saw made us both stop. 7 tents were arranged in a perfect circle around the mud pot, each tent positioned exactly the same distance from the center. The precision was unsettling. This was not a casual campsite. This was deliberate, intentional. The tents were high-quality expedition models, the kind used for winter mountaineering in extreme conditions. But there were no ski tracks leading away. No one was visible. Just 7 tents surrounding the thermal feature like some kind of ritual arrangement. Foster and I exchanged glances. He keyed his radio and reported our position and what we were seeing. Dispatch acknowledged and told us to proceed with caution. We skied down into the basin and approached the first tent. I called out, identifying ourselves as park rangers and requesting that whoever was inside come out and speak with us. No response. I unzipped the tent door and looked inside. Empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, just elk bones. Hundreds of elk bones arranged in geometric patterns across the floor of the tent. Skulls positioned at cardinal points, ribs laid out in spiraling formations. vertebrae stacked in precise towers. We checked the second tent. More bones. These were deer bones mixed with what looked like coyote skulls. The third tent contained only bird bones, thousands of them, sorted by size and type. Each tent was a bone repository, meticulously organized. But it was the center of the circle that made my blood run cold. A deer skull had been mounted on a wooden pole and planted directly above the boiling mud pot. The skull was decorated with painted symbols I did not recognize. The mud below churned and spat, occasionally throwing scalding droplets onto the snow around the perimeter. Foster discovered the journal in the fourth tent. It was a leather-bound book filled with handwritten entries in English, mixed with symbols and words, in a language neither of us could identify. The entries described something called feeding the old breath, and references to opening the steam door. There were diagrams showing the tent arrangement and detailed notes about lunar cycles and thermal activity patterns. One passage read, "The pact must be maintained every 40 years when the earth shivers. 7 shepherds return to the sacred steam. 7 offerings of bone to calm the fire below. If the ritual fails, the mountain will wake angry." We were photographing the journal when we heard it. Chanting, low and rhythmic, echoing from somewhere in the thermal features. The sound seemed to come from the steam vents themselves, rising with the sulfur-laden vapor. Foster and I moved toward the sound, following a narrow path between pools of boiling water. The chanting grew louder. Then we saw them. 7 figures emerged from the steam like apparitions materializing from fog. They wore elk hides draped over their shoulders, the heads still attached, creating grotesque hoods. Their faces were painted with white ash in patterns that mimicked the thermal features around us. They moved in single file, each carrying a bundle of bones. The lead figure was a woman, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed too large for her face. She stopped when she saw us. The others stopped behind her in perfect synchronization. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hiss of steam and the bubbling of the mud pot. Then she spoke. Her voice was clear despite the wind. "You have entered the sacred circle. You have touched the offerings. You do not understand what you have done." I told her they were in a restricted area and that backcountry camping without permits was a federal violation. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who found my words absurdly irrelevant. She said, "We are the shepherds. Our family has kept this pact since before your government claimed this land. We come every 40 years when the earth trembles. We feed the old breath with bones of the forest. We sing the calming words. If we do not, the mountain will erupt. Your park, your visitors, your cities built near the caldera, all of it will burn." Foster asked who they were and where they came from. The woman tilted her head. "We have no names you would recognize. We are descendants of those who lived here before the roads and the lodges. We are keepers of knowledge your science does not possess. The thermal features are not just geology. They are doorways, thresholds, and every 40 years they open wider. We perform the ritual to keep them closed." I explained that they needed to come with us back to park headquarters, that we could sort this out, but they could not remain in a closed area. The woman's expression hardened. "If you remove us before the ritual is complete, you will doom everyone. The seismic activity has already begun. Small tremors your instruments barely register, but we feel them. The mountain is restless. We have 2 more nights of offerings, 2 more cycles of chanting. Then the threshold will seal for another 40 years. Foster radioed for backup. Within an hour, 4 more rangers arrived on snowmobiles. The 7 figures did not resist when we told them they were being escorted out. They surrendered peacefully, gathering their belongings from the tents and dismantling the skull monument. But they said nothing more. They moved in silence as we led them back to the trailhead. When we reached the ranger station, we attempted to process them. They refused to provide legal names. They had no identification, no driver's licenses, no credit cards, nothing. When asked for names, they each said only Shepherd and a number, Shepherd 1 through Shepherd 7. We held them for 72 hours while attempting to identify them through fingerprints and facial recognition. Nothing came back. No criminal records, no missing person reports, no matches in any database. It was as if they did not exist in any official capacity. The federal prosecutor reviewed the case and determined there was insufficient evidence for charges beyond trespassing, which was a misdemeanor. With no identification and no prior offenses, they were released with citations and warnings. That night, they vanished from the county jail holding area. The cell was locked from the outside. No windows, no way out except through a door that required a key card. But when the guard checked at morning roll call, all 7 were gone. The security footage showed them sitting in the cell at 2:47 a.m. At 2:48 a.m., the feed went to static. At 2:49 a.m., the feed returned and the cell was empty. No one entered. No one left. They simply ceased to be there. I tried to forget about it. I told myself they had escaped through some method we had not detected and had fled the area. But then I started researching geological records. I found a pattern. Every 40 years since 1872, the year Yellowstone became a national park, there has been a significant seismic event within 6 months of February. 1912, a magnitude 4.5 earthquake near Norris. 1952, a magnitude 5.3 earthquake that damaged park infrastructure. 1992, a swarm of over 1,000 small earthquakes in the same region. 2018, a magnitude 4.4 earthquake that triggered evacuations of thermal areas due to unstable ground. We arrested the Shepherds in February 2019 before they could complete their ritual. In August of 2019, a magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck Yellowstone, centered near Norris Basin. It was the largest earthquake in the park in over a decade. Thermal features changed overnight. New geysers formed, old ones went dormant. One mud pot that had been stable for years suddenly expanded to 3 times its size, forcing the closure of a popular boardwalk. I do not sleep well anymore. I tell myself it is coincidence. That seismic activity in a volcanic caldera is normal and unpredictable, that there is no such thing as a ritual that can influence geological forces. But I cannot stop thinking about what that woman said, that every 40 years, the threshold opens wider. That next cycle is in 2059. I will be retired by then, or dead. But someone will be patrolling that basin in February of that year. And I wonder if they will find 7 tents arranged in a circle and 7 people in elk hides performing a ritual that our science cannot explain. And I wonder what will happen if we stop them again. I have a degree in wilderness search and rescue from the University of Montana. I understand statistics, probability models, and human behavior patterns in crisis situations. I have studied case files of hundreds of missing person incidents in national parks. I know that most disappearances follow predictable patterns. People get lost when they leave marked trails. They succumb to exposure when caught unprepared in sudden weather changes. They fall from cliffs while taking photos. They drown in rivers swollen with snowmelt. The human body is fragile and the wilderness is unforgiving. But nearly every disappearance can be explained through rational analysis of environmental factors and decision-making errors. What happened to the family at Shoshone Lake in July of 2018 does not fit any model I have ever studied. It does not fit any pattern in the literature. It remains the only case in my 8-year career that I cannot explain. My name is Brielle. I work as a search and rescue coordinator for Yellowstone National Park. When someone fails to return from a backcountry trip, I am the person who assembles the search teams, coordinates helicopter reconnaissance, manages the incident command structure, and ultimately makes the decision about when to suspend active searching. It is a responsibility I do not take lightly. Every missing person represents someone's family member, and I have sat with enough devastated relatives to understand the weight of those decisions. But this case haunts me in ways the others do not, because we never found any trace of what happened. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, no logical explanation, just a family that ceased to exist in a location where vanishing should be impossible. The family was named Whitmore, Robert and Jennifer, both 38, and their 2 children, Emma, age 10, and Lucas, age 7. They were experienced backpackers from Oregon who had obtained a permit for a 3-day, 2-night trip around Shoshone Lake, one of the largest backcountry lakes in the park. Their itinerary was detailed and professional. They had listed their campsite locations, expected mileage per day, and emergency contact information. Robert was a physician. Jennifer was a high school biology teacher. Their gear list showed they were well prepared with appropriate equipment: bear canisters, water filtration, first aid supplies, and satellite communication devices. They checked in at the ranger station on July 14th at 9 a.m., received their permit briefing, and began their hike. They were expected to return by 4 p.m. on July 16th. When they had not returned by 6 p.m. on the 16th, their emergency contact, Jennifer's sister, called the park. Sometimes hikers run late due to slower than expected pace or because they are enjoying themselves and lose track of time. We typically allow a grace period before initiating search protocols. But by 8 p.m., with no sign of the family, I was notified and began assembling a hasty team. We deployed at first light on July 17th. I led a 4-person team directly to their last known campsite at the south end of Shoshone Lake, approximately 8 miles from the trailhead. We reached the site at 10:30 a.m. What we found made no sense. The camp was completely intact. The tent was properly erected and staked. Inside were 4 sleeping bags, laid out flat and unzipped, as if the occupants had gotten up normally in the morning. 4 pairs of hiking boots were lined up neatly outside the tent door. The bear canister was hanging correctly from the food pole and was still full of their remaining supplies. Camp chairs were arranged around a cold fire ring. A water filter sat beside a cookpot near the lake shore. Everything suggested a family that had simply stepped away from camp for a short walk and planned to return. But there were disturbing details. On the camp's picnic table, we found 4 driver's licenses and 4 park entry cards stacked in a neat pile. Beside them were 2 wedding rings, Jennifer's engagement ring, and a child's plastic friendship bracelet, all arranged in a precise line. This was not normal behavior. People do not remove their identification and jewelry and arrange them geometrically before going for a hike. Underneath the ID cards was a handwritten note on a page torn from a journal. The handwriting analysis later confirmed it was Jennifer's writing. The note contained only 1 sentence: "We heard the calling. We are going below." I immediately radioed for additional search resources. We expanded the search perimeter and began systematic grid patterns around the campsite. We searched the shoreline in both directions. We checked the forest. We looked for any sign of the family, tracks, disturbed vegetation, torn clothing, anything. A thermal pool sits approximately 50 feet from the campsite. It is a small feature, maybe 8 feet in diameter, with water temperature measured at 180 degrees Fahrenheit and a pH level acidic enough to dissolve organic material. We examined it carefully, but found no disturbance in the mineral deposits around its edge. No footprints. No indication anyone had approached it. We brought in cadaver dogs on day 2 of the search. The dogs are trained to detect human remains and can alert on scent even if a body is submerged or buried. Both dogs indicated interest at the thermal pool but refused to approach the water. They would walk to within about 10 feet, sit, and whine. Their handlers described it as unusual behavior, as if the dogs sensed something but were afraid to get closer. We requested dive team support to search the pool, but the request was denied due to safety concerns. The water temperature and acidity make diving impossible. Any diver entering that pool would suffer catastrophic injuries within seconds. On day 3, a geological survey team arrived with ground-penetrating radar. They wanted to map the thermal pool to understand its structure. What they discovered was remarkable and terrifying. The pool connects to an unexplored cave system. The radar showed a vertical shaft dropping approximately 40 feet below the visible pool, then branching into multiple horizontal passages that extend in several directions. One passage runs roughly 4 miles to the northeast before the radar signal weakened and they lost definition. The cave system is flooded with the same superheated acidic water as the surface pool. It is completely inaccessible. No human could survive entry, and no robotic equipment we have can function in those conditions. The search expanded to 40 square miles over 9 days. We deployed helicopter reconnaissance with thermal imaging. We had over 60 personnel combing the area. We checked every trail, every drainage, every meadow within a reasonable distance from the campsite. We found nothing. No clothing, no equipment they might have carried. No sign that 4 people had walked through the forest. It was as if they had vanished from the campsite itself without taking a single step. I interviewed other campers who had been in the area during that time period. A couple camping 2 miles north reported hearing unusual sounds on the night of July 15th. They described it as a low humming or vibration that seemed to come from underground. It lasted for several hours starting around midnight. They said it made them feel nauseous and disoriented. Another solo hiker reported seeing lights near Shoshone Lake that same night. Not flashlights or campfires, but a blue-green glow that appeared to emanate from the lake itself or from beneath it. He said he watched it for about 10 minutes before it faded. Both reports were logged, but neither seemed directly related to the Whitmore family disappearance. We officially suspended active searching on July 25th after exhausting all reasonable search areas and methods. The case was classified as a missing person investigation, with suspected foul play ruled out due to lack of evidence. The FBI took over jurisdiction and conducted their own investigation. They found nothing we had not already documented. The case remains open but inactive. The Whitmore family is still listed as missing. Their vehicle was towed from the trailhead parking area and eventually returned to family members. Their home in Oregon remains as they left it, filled with vacation plans and summer schedules that will never be fulfilled. I have led 47 search and rescue operations in my 8 years with the Park Service. I have found lost hikers after days of searching. I have recovered remains from cliff falls and drownings. I have solved disappearances that initially seemed mysterious, but proved to have mundane explanations. But the Whitmore family simply vanished. 4 people, including 2 children, gone without a trace from a campsite that showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of wildlife attack, No indication of anything except a deliberate decision to leave their identities behind and go somewhere. The note haunts me more than anything else. "We heard the calling. We are going below." What calling? Below where? The thermal pool is the only feature near that campsite that goes below ground level. But no one could enter that pool and survive. Yet the cadaver dogs indicated something was there. The geological survey showed passages extending for miles underground. And witnesses reported strange phenomena the same night the family disappeared. I do not believe in supernatural explanations. I am a scientist. I trust data and evidence. But I cannot explain this case using any framework I understand. Sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, I think about that unexplored cave system beneath Shoshone Lake. I think about where those passages lead and what might exist in the superheated darkness miles below the surface. I think about a family that heard something calling to them. Something compelling enough that they removed their wedding rings and left their identities behind to answer it. And I think about the fact that we will never know what happened. Because the only place they could have gone is somewhere no living person can follow. They tell you about the physical dangers when you sign up for winter ranger duty in the backcountry. The cold that can freeze exposed skin in 3 minutes. The avalanches that bury entire valleys under tons of snow. The grizzly bears that wake from hibernation, angry and starving. The distance from any medical facility, any backup, any help if something goes wrong. They brief you on hypothermia protocols and emergency extraction procedures. They check your gear 3 times and make you demonstrate proficiency with a satellite communicator. They warn you about the wildlife and the weather and the isolation. But they do not tell you what 87 days of total solitude does to your mind. They do not mention that the greatest threat you will face might not come from the wilderness outside, but from something that happens inside your own head when you are completely and utterly alone for 3 months straight. My name is Hayden. I have been a backcountry ranger for Yellowstone National Park for 9 years. I have done multiple winter assignments at remote stations where you spend weeks without seeing another human being. I thought I understood isolation. I thought I was prepared. In December of 2020, I volunteered for a winter posting at the Thoroughfare Patrol Cabin, which sits in the most remote section of the park. The cabin is 32 miles from the nearest road. It is accessible only by horse in summer or by ski in winter. No snowmobiles are permitted due to wilderness designation. No helicopters except for emergencies. Once you are stationed there, you are truly cut off from everything. The assignment runs from December 1st through mid-February. 87 days. You are resupplied once in early January when another ranger skis in with food and fuel. Otherwise, you are alone. The cabin itself is small. 1 room with a wood stove, a bunk, a table, and basic supplies. There are shelves with books left by previous rangers. A radio that connects you to park headquarters for scheduled check-ins twice weekly. Solar panels that charge a battery system for minimal electricity. Your duties are simple. Monitor wildlife, document weather conditions, watch for poaching activity, maintain the cabin, and survive. I arrived on December 3rd after a grueling 2-day ski trek with a pack weighing over 80 pounds. The ranger I was replacing looked exhausted. He helped me unload my gear, gave me a quick tour of the cabin systems, and then he left within an hour. He barely spoke. I asked him if he had any advice for the winter ahead. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes and said only this: "Do not go outside at night unless absolutely necessary, and do not trust what you hear." The first month was manageable. I fell into a routine. Wake at dawn, stoke the fire, melt snow for water, eat breakfast, ski a patrol route, return to cabin, record observations, read, cook dinner, sleep. The days were short. Sunrise around 8 a.m. and sunset by 4:30 p.m. That left over 15 hours of darkness each day. The silence was profound. No traffic sounds, no aircraft, no human voices. Just wind through the pines and the occasional howl of a wolf pack in the distance. I had brought books and a journal. I wrote extensively about what I saw during patrols. Elk herds moving through valleys, wolf tracks in the snow, the steam from thermal features creating ice crystals that hung in the air like diamonds. But in week 6, things began to change. I started hearing footsteps outside the cabin at night, distinct sounds of boots crunching through snow, walking around the perimeter of the cabin in slow, deliberate circles. The first time it happened, I assumed it was an elk or a moose. Large animals sometimes approach buildings in winter looking for shelter from wind. But when I looked outside the next morning, there were no tracks. The snow around the cabin was pristine and undisturbed. I told myself I had imagined it, that the wind had created sounds my brain interpreted as footsteps. The footsteps came again 3 nights later. This time I was certain. Someone was walking around the cabin. I could hear each step clearly. The weight, the rhythm. I grabbed my flashlight and bear spray and opened the door. Nothing. No one there. I shone the light in all directions. Empty forest. Fresh snow that had fallen that afternoon showed no tracks anywhere near the cabin except the path I had made earlier returning from patrol. I stood in the doorway for 10 minutes listening. Complete silence. I went back inside and locked the door, even though locks are meaningless in wilderness this remote. Who would I be locking out? By week 8, I began seeing something at the edge of the tree line. A figure standing motionless about 50 yards from the cabin. I would notice it at dusk just as the light was fading, a dark shape among the trees. Too tall to be a stump, too still to be an animal. I would watch it through the window. It never moved. After several minutes, I would look away to grab binoculars or to stoke the fire. When I looked back, the figure would be gone. Or sometimes it would be closer, still motionless, still watching. One evening, I convinced myself to go outside and investigate. I put on my coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked toward where the figure had been standing. There was nothing there. No tracks. No broken branches. Nothing to indicate anyone or anything had been present. The knocking started in week 9. 3 deliberate knocks on the cabin wall. Always at 2:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I would wake instantly and check my watch. The knocks were loud enough to wake me, but not aggressive. Just 3 measured impacts against the exterior wall on the east side of the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence. I would lie in my bunk listening, but the knocks never repeated. In the morning, I would go outside and examine the wall. No marks. No indication anything had struck the wood. I tried to rationalize it. Thermal expansion of the logs as temperatures fluctuated. Ice falling from the roof. Branches blown by wind. But none of those explanations fit the consistency and precision of what I was hearing. And the timing was always exactly 2:47 a.m. to the minute. Every time. In week 10, I found my ranger uniform hanging from a tree branch 100 yards from the cabin. I discovered it during morning patrol. My official uniform shirt and pants neatly hung as if on a closet hanger, swaying gently in the breeze. This was impossible. I was wearing my only uniform. I checked when I returned to the cabin. My uniform was in my pack where I always kept it. I had not taken it outside. I had not hung anything on trees. Yet there it was. An identical uniform, same size, same wear patterns, hanging in the forest as if placed there by someone who knew exactly where I would walk. I radioed headquarters during my next scheduled check-in. I tried to explain what was happening without sounding insane. The ranger who answered suggested I might be experiencing stress and asked if I wanted early extraction. I said no. I had signed up for 87 days and I would complete the assignment. But I asked if there was any history of unusual incidents at this cabin. There was a long pause. Then the ranger said that some winter assignments had been terminated early due to ranger welfare concerns. But he could not discuss details. He reminded me that isolation affects people differently and that requesting extraction was not considered a failure. I stopped sleeping through the nights. I would doze in short intervals, but wake frequently. Week 11 brought something new. I woke at dawn to realize I was outside, not near the cabin, not on the porch. I was 200 yards away in the forest, standing in 2 feet of snow, wearing only my thermal underwear. My feet were bare. The temperature was 15 degrees below zero. My feet were already numb and turning white. I ran back to the cabin, stumbling and falling. I got inside and spent an hour warming my feet in lukewarm water to prevent frostbite. When the feeling returned, the pain was extraordinary. But worse than the pain was the realization that I had walked outside in my sleep with no memory of doing so. I could have died. If I had walked farther, or if the temperature had been colder, I would have died. I went outside later that morning to examine my tracks. They formed a perfect circle around the cabin. I had walked in a circle 23 times, each circuit following the exact same path. The tracks were evenly spaced, mechanical, not the wandering path of someone confused or disoriented. I had walked with purpose, repeating the same pattern over and over, before finally stopping in the forest. I also found something else. My journal was sitting on a rock outcrop 50 feet from where I had stopped walking. The journal I kept in the cabin. I retrieved it and opened to the last entry. Beneath my final notes from the previous day was new writing, my handwriting. Words I did not remember writing. I am not alone. I have never been alone. There are 7 of me now. I radioed for emergency extraction. I told headquarters I needed immediate removal from the station. The ranger asked if I was in medical distress. I said I was not sure, but that I could not stay any longer. He said the earliest they could arrange helicopter extraction was 3 days due to weather conditions and availability. I had to wait. I barricaded myself inside the cabin. I did not go outside except to get firewood. I did not sleep. I sat at the table with my knife and bear spray and counted the hours. The figure appeared at the window on the second night. Not at the tree line, at the window. A face pressed against the glass looking in. My face, my exact features staring at me from outside. I shouted and ran to the door. When I opened it, nothing was there. But in the snow beneath the window were footprints. Boot prints identical to mine. The pattern matched my boots exactly. The prints led away from the cabin in a straight line and then stopped after 20 feet. Just stopped. The way Quinn's mysterious tracks had stopped in the thoroughfare. The way everything unexplainable in this place seemed to end without resolution. The helicopter arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. The pilot said I looked wrong, that I appeared to have aged 10 years. I was 34 years old, but he said I looked 44. I saw my reflection in the helicopter window. He was right. My hair had gone gray at the temples, deep lines around my eyes that had not been there 11 weeks earlier. The park psychologist conducted an evaluation. Standard protocol for early extraction. She found no evidence of mental illness, no psychotic symptoms, no hallucinations that fit diagnostic criteria. Just extreme stress response consistent with prolonged isolation in a hostile environment. She asked if I would return to winter backcountry assignments. I said no. She noted that in my file and cleared me for return to regular duties. They wanted to send another ranger to the thoroughfare cabin to complete the winter season. I told my supervisor he should burn the cabin down, that it was not safe, that something about that location was wrong in ways I could not articulate. He looked at me with sympathy but did not take my recommendation seriously. 2 weeks later, a ranger named Marcus was sent to finish the winter assignment. He lasted 12 days before requesting extraction. He would not explain why. He filed a report that remains classified. I ran into him 6 months later at a training session. He would not make eye contact with me. When I asked what happened at the cabin, he walked away without speaking. I still work for Yellowstone. I do summer patrols in tourist-heavy areas where I interact with hundreds of people every day. I will never do isolated backcountry work again. And I will never return to the thoroughfare. Whatever exists in that remote corner of the park, whether it originates from the land itself or from something that happens to the human mind when it is pushed too far into solitude, it should be left alone. Some places are not meant for human habitation during the dark months of winter. Some silences should not be broken. And some questions about what we see and hear in the deepest wilderness should never be answered. I need to tell someone about this before it happens again. And I know it will happen again because he is still out there and the FBI cannot find him. My name is Piper. I have been a law enforcement ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 7 years. I have dealt with drunk tourists, poachers, drug trafficking through the park, domestic violence incidents at campgrounds, and one homicide investigation. I thought I had seen the worst of human behavior in a wilderness setting. But nothing prepared me for the case that started in August of 2022 and remains unsolved to this day. Nothing prepared me for the realization that someone had been watching women sleep in their tents for years, photographing them, visiting them, and we had no idea until it was almost too late. The first report came through on August 7th. A woman named Sarah Martinez had been backpacking alone on the Cascade Lake Trail. She was 31 years old, an experienced hiker from Colorado who had obtained a backcountry permit for 3 nights. She completed her trip without incident, returned to her vehicle at the trailhead, and was preparing to drive out of the park when she noticed something tucked under her windshield wiper. Not a parking citation or an advertisement. A photograph. A photograph of herself sleeping in her tent, taken from inside the tent, looking down at her face on the pillow. She brought it to the ranger station immediately. I was the one who took her report. She was visibly shaken. The photo was a standard 4x6 print on glossy paper, the kind you get from any photo processing service. It showed Sarah in her sleeping bag, eyes closed, completely unaware someone was standing over her with a camera. The angle suggested the photographer had been crouched or kneeling beside her. The tent fabric was visible in the frame, confirming this was taken from inside her tent while she slept. On the back of the photo, written in neat block letters with a black marker, was a single word: visited. I asked Sarah if she had heard anything unusual during the nights she camped. She said no. She was a light sleeper and always woke when animals approached the campsite. But she had not heard anyone enter her tent. I asked if she had noticed anyone following her on the trail or camped nearby. Again, no. She had seen other hikers during the day, but no one suspicious. Her campsite had been at a designated location along the east shore of Cascade Lake. It was a popular area during peak season. I filed an incident report and opened an investigation, but I told Sarah honestly that without more evidence or information about the suspect, there was little we could do beyond increasing patrol presence on that trail. 3 days later, another woman filed a similar report. Then another. Over the next 2 weeks, 5 women came forward with identical stories. All solo female hikers. All had completed multi-day backcountry trips on different trails throughout the park. All had found photos of themselves sleeping in their tents left on their vehicles when they returned. Every photo was taken from inside the tent. Every photo showed the woman asleep and vulnerable. And every photo had the same word written on the back: visited. This was no longer a single incident. This was a pattern. Someone was systematically targeting solo female backpackers, accessing their tents while they slept, photographing them at close range, and then tracking their vehicles to leave the photos where they would be found. The level of skill required was disturbing. To enter a tent without waking the occupant requires extreme care. To do it repeatedly without being detected suggested someone who moved through the wilderness with professional competence. To track the vehicles suggested he was watching the trailheads, documenting license plates and parking locations. I coordinated with FBI agents who have jurisdiction over major crimes in national parks. They reviewed all 5 cases and determined we were dealing with a serial stalker who posed an escalating threat. The current behavior was non-contact surveillance, but the psychological profile suggested someone who might eventually progress to physical assault. They approved a sting operation. I volunteered to be the bait. On August 23rd, I obtained a backcountry permit under a false name. I parked a rental vehicle at the Cascade Lake trailhead and hiked in alone, carrying minimal gear but wearing a concealed body camera and a GPS tracker. I also carried my service weapon and bear spray. 2 backup rangers were positioned at a camp location 1 mile away, monitoring my GPS signal and prepared to respond within 10 minutes if I activated my panic button. I made camp at one of the designated sites where previous incidents had occurred, set up my tent, ate dinner, and pretended to settle in for the night. I did not sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag fully clothed with my hand on my weapon and my eyes barely closed. The body camera was positioned to record anyone who entered the tent. Hours passed. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. I was beginning to think he would not come when I heard it. The softest sound of a tent zipper being drawn slowly open. I kept my eyes closed, but tightened my grip on my weapon. I could hear breathing. Someone was inside my tent. I could feel the presence of another person kneeling beside me. The faint click of a camera shutter. I opened my eyes and sat up in one motion, simultaneously drawing my weapon and activating the panic button. Federal agent, do not move. The figure lunged backward, crashing through the tent door and into the darkness. I scrambled out after him, flashlight in one hand and weapon in the other. I caught a glimpse of a man running into the forest. I pursued for approximately 50 yards before losing him in the dense trees. My backup arrived within 8 minutes. We conducted an immediate search of the area, but he had vanished. But the body camera had captured his face. When we reviewed the footage, I recognized him immediately. He was a volunteer search and rescue member who had worked with the Park Service for 3 years. He had participated in training exercises. He had access to backcountry permits and trailhead information. He had legitimate reasons to be in the park at all hours. His name was Michael Brennan, age 36, with no criminal record. He lived in a town 40 miles from the park and worked as a wilderness guide for a private touring company. The footage also captured something else. Before he realized I was awake, he had placed something on the ground beside my sleeping bag. We recovered it during the search. It was a binder. A 3-ring binder containing plastic sheet protectors, and inside those protectors were photographs. Over 200 photographs of women sleeping in tents. Some I recognized from the recent reports, but most were women I had never seen. The photos dated back years based on the clothing and gear visible in the frames. Some had handwritten notes on the back with dates and locations. Some had names. Some just had the word "visited." We issued a warrant for Brennan's arrest. Federal agents went to his home the next morning. He was gone. His vehicle was gone. He had packed and fled sometime during the night after the confrontation. A search of his residence found more evidence. A detailed map of Yellowstone and surrounding national forests with campsites marked. A database on his computer listing women's names, physical descriptions, hiking itineraries he had somehow obtained, and notes about their camping habits. Equipment for developing photographs. Climbing gear that would allow him to move silently through the forest. The manhunt lasted 6 days. They tracked him through credit card usage and traffic cameras. He stayed ahead of them, moving through back roads and wilderness areas. On day 6, they located his vehicle abandoned at a trailhead in Bridger Teton National Forest. He had gone into the backcountry on foot. Search teams combed the area for another week. They found no trace of him. Michael Brennan vanished into the wilderness he knew so well. That was 2 years ago. He has never been found. But every few months, another woman in another park somewhere in the western United States reports finding a photograph of herself sleeping in her tent. Different parks, different states. Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, Oregon, Washington. The photos are always the same format, always taken from inside the tent, always with the word "visited" written on the back in the same block letters. Sometimes there are dates, sometimes there are new notes. One woman found a photo with the message, "You looked peaceful. I almost did not want to leave." The FBI has him on their most wanted list for federal stalking charges. His photo is distributed to every national park and Forest Service office in the country. But he is still out there, still watching, still visiting, still photographing women while they sleep. And I carry the weight of knowing that we had him and we lost him. That the operation I led pushed him further underground and possibly made him more dangerous. I do not camp alone anymore. None of the female rangers in our district do. We travel in pairs for backcountry patrols. We check each other's tents before sleeping. We take turns staying awake on overnight assignments. Because we know he could be anyone. A volunteer, a permitted camper, another hiker passing on the trail, someone who looks friendly and helpful and trustworthy during the day. And then, at night, he becomes someone else. Someone who moves like a ghost through the darkness, entering tents without sound, standing over sleeping women, taking his photographs, and disappearing before dawn. If you are a woman who camps alone in backcountry areas, please be careful. Lock your tent zippers with clips. Place noise-making devices like bells or gravel in a bag near the door. Sleep with bear spray within reach. And if you ever find a photograph of yourself sleeping left somewhere, you will discover it. Contact law enforcement immediately. Because Michael Brennan is still out there, and the FBI believes he will not stop until he is caught or until he escalates to something worse than photographs. I think about those 200 women whose pictures were in his binder. How many of them never knew they were visited? How many of them hiked out of the wilderness, having no idea someone had been inside their tent, watching them breathe? And I think about the women he has visited since then, who will find their photographs days or weeks later, and realize that while they slept, completely vulnerable and alone, a stranger was standing over them in the darkness. My grandfather was one of the first rangers at Yellowstone National Park in 1946. Hired as part of the post-war expansion when veterans returned home, and the Park Service was rebuilding its workforce after years of wartime staffing shortages. His name was Robert Spencer Holt. He worked at Yellowstone for 37 years before retiring in 1983, 3 years before I was born. I never met him in life. He died when my father was still young, and all I knew of him came from old photographs and the stories my father told. Stories about a man who loved the wilderness more than anything, who spent his entire adult life protecting a landscape he considered sacred. But in September of 2021, I met him anyway, on the trail to Lone Star Geyser. And what he showed me changed everything I thought I understood about death and about the land we are sworn to protect. My name is Spencer. I was named after my grandfather, carrying his middle name as my first, a family tradition meant to honor the man who had set the path that I would eventually follow. I joined the National Park Service when I was 24, and I specifically requested assignment to Yellowstone because I wanted to walk the same trails he had walked, to see the same geysers he had monitored, to understand what had called to him so powerfully that he devoted his entire life to this place. I have been a ranger here for 6 years. I know the park well. I know its trails, its wildlife patterns, its thermal features, and its dangers. I thought I knew everything about Yellowstone that mattered. I was wrong. The incident occurred on September 17th, 2021. I was conducting a routine patrol on the trail to Lone Star Geyser, a popular but moderately challenging hike that follows the Firehole River for about 2.5 miles into the backcountry. It was a clear afternoon with temperatures in the low 60s. Perfect hiking weather. The trail was busy with day hikers, and I had stopped several times to answer questions about wildlife and thermal features. Around 3 p.m., as I was approaching the geyser itself, I noticed a man ahead of me on the trail. He was wearing a ranger uniform, but not the current style. The uniform was the old design from the 1940s and 50s. Dark green wool with a wide-brimmed campaign hat. The kind you see in historical photographs, but never in actual use anymore. I assumed it was someone dressed for a historical reenactment or educational program. The park occasionally hosts living history events where volunteers dress in period clothing. I picked up my pace to catch up with him, intending to ask which program he was participating in. He turned as I approached and waved at me. A friendly, casual gesture. Then he continued walking. I called out, "Excuse me, sir." He did not respond. He simply maintained his pace, following the trail deeper into the forest. I followed, curious now. The trail to Lone Star Geyser is well defined and straightforward, but he veered off onto a side path I had never noticed before. A faint game trail leading through dense lodgepole pines toward what appeared to be a small meadow. I hesitated. Rangers do not leave marked trails during patrols unless there is a specific reason, an emergency or a report of illegal activity. But something compelled me to follow. I cannot explain it rationally. It felt necessary. I turned off the main trail and followed the man in the vintage uniform into the forest. The game trail was narrow and overgrown. Branches scraped against my pack. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss. After about 200 yards, the trees opened into a small meadow I had never seen before despite patrolling this area dozens of times. The man was standing in the center of the meadow, facing away from me. He pointed down at the ground at his feet and spoke for the first time. His voice was clear, but somehow distant, as if coming from farther away than his physical position suggested. He said, "This is where it happened." I moved closer and asked, what happened? He turned to look at me. I saw his face clearly for the first time, and I recognized him. I recognized him from the photographs I had seen throughout my childhood. The same strong jawline, the same deep-set eyes, the same expression of calm authority. It was my grandfather, Robert Spencer Holt, who had been dead for 38 years. I should have run. I should have been terrified. But I was not. I felt only a profound sense of peace and curiosity. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You will understand when you dig." I asked what I should dig for. He simply smiled, a sad, gentle smile, and said, "You will know." Then he turned and walked toward the tree line. I watched him go. He walked with the same deliberate, measured pace. And then he simply vanished. Not faded, not disappeared gradually. He walked into the shadows beneath the pines and ceased to exist between one step and the next. I stood in the meadow for several minutes, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Hallucination seemed the most rational explanation. But I felt completely lucid. I was not tired. I was not dehydrated. I had not hit my head. I was simply standing in a meadow where my dead grandfather had appeared, spoken to me, and vanished. I looked down at the spot where he had been standing and pointing. The ground looked normal, grass and wildflowers and moss. Nothing unusual, but I marked the location carefully using landmarks and GPS coordinates. Then I hiked back to the main trail and continued my patrol in a daze. I did not report what had happened. How could I? What would I say? That I had seen a ghost? That my grandfather's spirit had led me off trail to show me something? I would be sent for psychiatric evaluation. I would be removed from duty. So I said nothing. But I could not stop thinking about it. That night, I reviewed historical records about my grandfather's career. I read his personnel files, which are available to family members through the Park Service archives. I found references to patrols he had conducted, locations he had been assigned to, incidents he had responded to. One entry from 1951 caught my attention. My grandfather had reported his official ranger badge as stolen during a backcountry patrol. The badge was never recovered. He was issued a replacement, and the theft was noted in his file, but never solved. The location where he reported the theft was listed as the Lone Star Geyser area. The date was September 19th, 1951. Exactly 70 years and 2 days before I had seen him on the trail. I decided I had to go back to the meadow. I requested a day off and returned on September 20th with a shovel, a metal detector, and ground-penetrating radar equipment I borrowed under the pretense of conducting a geological survey. I found the meadow again without difficulty. The GPS coordinates I had marked led me directly to it. I began scanning the area with the metal detector. Within minutes, I got a strong signal at the exact spot where my grandfather had been standing. I began to dig. The soil was soft and came away easily. At approximately 3 feet depth, I hit something solid. I cleared the dirt carefully and found a metal object wrapped in oilcloth. I pulled it up and unwrapped it. Inside was a ranger badge, an original 1940s-era National Park Service badge, the kind my grandfather would have worn. I turned it over. Engraved on the back was his full name, Robert Spencer Holt. Beneath the badge was a piece of paper, also wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting was clear. The note read, "For my grandson, when he follows the same path. You will find this when I need you to know I'm still watching the park. Some rangers never leave. We just change how we serve. Keep this with you. It will remind you that this land is more than geology and biology. It is memory, it is continuity, it is sacred. Protect it as I did." Signed, Robert Spencer Holt, September 19th, 1982. The date made my breath catch. September 19th, 1982. 1 year before my grandfather died. 31 years before I was hired as a ranger. He had buried this badge and this note in a meadow off the Lone Star Geyser Trail with the knowledge that someday, somehow, I would find it. He could not have known I would become a ranger. I was not even born yet. But he knew, or he hoped. And he left this message for me. I contacted my father and asked if he knew anything about this meadow or about grandfather burying something. My father was shocked. He said that in the year before grandfather died, he had requested that his ashes be scattered at a specific location in Yellowstone. He had given the family precise coordinates. My father looked them up. The coordinates matched the meadow where I had found the badge. My grandfather's ashes were scattered in that meadow in October 1983, as he had requested. He had chosen the exact spot where, 1 year earlier, he had buried his badge and a note for a grandson who did not yet exist. He had somehow known that I would be drawn to this place, that I would follow the same calling he had followed, and that I would need to know he was still present in the landscape he loved. I carry that badge on every patrol now. I keep it in my chest pocket, close to my heart. And sometimes, late in the evening when the light is fading and I am walking the trails alone, I see that figure in the old uniform at the edge of meadows or standing beside thermal features. Always at a distance, always watching. He never approaches, he never speaks again. He just stands there, a silent presence, keeping watch over his park. I understand now what he was trying to tell me. Some rangers never really leave Yellowstone. We become part of it. Our presence soaks into the soil and the steam and the stone. We patrol these trails long after our bodies have turned to ash and scattered on the wind. And for those who come after us, who carry the same dedication and the same love for this sacred landscape, we remain visible, not as ghosts, not as hauntings, but as echoes of service that never truly ends. I will work at Yellowstone for as long as I am able, and when my time comes, I will ask that my ashes be scattered in that same meadow where my grandfather rests. And perhaps, decades from now, another ranger will walk these trails and see two figures in vintage uniforms standing watch together. And they will understand that this park is more than a job. It is a calling that transcends life and death. It is a promise we make to the land and to each other, to protect, to preserve, to never truly leave.